Hello, everyone. We'll give everyone a minute or two to finish connecting here via Zoom, or if you're tuning in via YouTube or Facebook or LinkedIn, welcome as well. We'll get started in just a minute or two. If you're here via Zoom, please feel free to say hello to everyone via the chat. Perhaps tell folks where in the world you are connecting from and anything else you'd like to share. Several hundred hellos are all happening at once in the chat. Very nice to see everyone from pretty much everywhere, it seems. And welcome, welcome. Give folks just another minute to finish connecting their audio and video. And again, if you've tuned in via LinkedIn or Facebook or YouTube, welcome as well. We're here primarily via Zoom, where we'll have all of our guest speakers as well as the Q&A. But we will do our best to answer as many of the questions here as we can. And if you're watching online afterward, hopefully we will have anticipated any questions you all might have. All right, just a final check. If you can hear me here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, do just wave hello if you could. All right. Well, hello world. This is CS50's now annual workshop on how to prepare for technical interviews. This is an opportunity that we hold traditionally on campus and nowadays also on Zoom for students here at Harvard, at Yale University, as well as now anyone online who are thinking about pursuing summertime opportunities in the technology world or full-time opportunities after school, or perhaps are pivoting later in life and are exploring computer science and programming and software engineering and want to ultimately move into that world. This workshop is specifically on how to prepare for the kinds of interviews that you might encounter in industry. It's one thing to take classes like CS50 or anything else that sort of prepare you indirectly for a foundation in software engineering and the like, but it's another thing to actually ready yourself for the concrete opportunities that might be of interest to you at a tech company or really any other company at which you might be applying your technical skills. So thanks to CS50's own Tommy MacWilliam, who was one of CS50's former head teaching fellows today, we should have an amazing workshop for you that should give you the mindset of how to go about preparing for interviews, how to go about preparing your resume, and really ultimately how about applying what you might learn fairly theoretically in school to the actual practical world of interviewing and ultimately working as well. And wonderfully, we're joined here by some of our other former and current head teaching fellows, Maria and Connor, who you'll meet in just a moment. But before we turn over the reins to today's special guests, we'd like to do a souvenir photo of sorts. If everyone would like to put on a smile, if your camera is currently off and you would like to opt into this, turn your camera on now. If you'd like to opt out of this, turn your camera off now. And in just a moment, feel free to put on your best wave or smile. And our colleague behind the scenes here is going to be screenshotting as many of the Zoom screens as we can. And he's written some fancy software, our colleague Rong Shin here, that's going to automatically stitch together anything that looks like a face and a name and a smile and a wave. So hopefully we will catch you at a good moment, and hopefully your internet connection is working right now so that we can indeed include you in the final souvenir photo.
Well said. Thank you, David.
All right. Thank you to everyone, as well as to Rong Shin. So allow me now to introduce our friend and former colleague, Tommy MacWilliam, who most recently worked at companies like Quora.com and most recently his own startup, Serenade.ai. Tommy is hands down one of the smartest people and best engineers I've ever met. Indeed, in preparing for interviews, I got to thinking that I'm not sure if Tommy interviewed me, I would get the job. And so it's always quite interesting to hear about the advice he has, the types of experiences he's had, because not only was he a former student and a former teaching fellow, and now out there in the real world hiring and building software, he's really seen it all. And so I think we're fortunate to have not only him, but also Maria and Connor joining us here today. And so without further ado, Tommy, welcome back to CS50.
Thanks, David. It's always great to be back. I love doing this interview workshop and helping everybody think about
how to prepare their resume, get ready for interviews, do a great job interviewing, and then think about what to do after that. I think I've been on both sides of interviews. I've probably done thousands of interviews as the interviewer. I've also been on the other side, and I've also bombed interviews myself, so I know exactly how that feels. And helping with this workshop, and we're really hoping to help everybody just give the best interview performance they can, and really demonstrate the skills that you have as an engineer. So joining me today are Maria and Connor. So I'll turn it over to Maria to introduce herself as well.
Hi, everyone. Super awesome to be here and super excited for our session today. Used to be head TF of CS50 for a few years, back until 2018. Since then, have worked at Instagram as a software engineer and most recently as a co-founder of my own startup called Kangaroo. And very excited to be here today. As Tommy said, I've also bombed my very fair share of interviews. Have like some very clear memories of the ones I bombed. I've also been on the other side, done probably hundreds, definitely not thousands at Tommy's level just yet. But the interview process is definitely something that I'm eager to help everyone master. So excited to be here, and I'm going to hand it off to Connor.
All right. Hi, everyone. I am Connor. I am currently a head CA for CS50 at the college. And I am currently a junior at the college. So I'm applying for internships for next summer, 2023, or 2022, sorry. And so I have been having several interviews a week for the past week. So I'm right in the middle of it. And just like other people have been saying, I've had some of those interviews go very, very well, and some of them go very, very badly. So I'm really excited to learn more about how to help those go a little bit better than they could possibly, and also to help all of you get started in interviews.
All right, so let's jump right in. I'll share my screen here. All right. So today we're going to cover a few different things, sort of the entire interview process from end to end. So first, we're going to talk about how to choose companies and pick opportunities that are great for you and where you're going to have a great experience. Next, we're going to talk about resumes. Not going to spend a ton of time on this, but just some quick, simple rules for putting together a great resume. Then we'll talk a bit about how to prepare before a tech interview happens. Then we'll walk through during the interview, sort of what's expected for you, and as well as some tips and tricks for doing well in the technical interview portion itself. Then we're going to have a couple of mock interviews. So one with Maria and one with Connor. We'll sort of simulate an actual tech interview. We'll use real questions that I've used in the past. So these just aren't sort of fake random questions, but these are real questions that you could see at a tech company. We'll sort of go over some techniques there. And then last, we'll sort of wrap up with some things you can do after the interview and sort of looking ahead as you improve your interviewing skills. So the first thing I want to talk about is choosing companies. So there's obviously, as you're looking around at internships and full-time opportunities, there are so many companies and opportunities out there. And so what you want to do is help narrow that down into a small set. Nobody wants to be doing 500 interviews a month. You're going to exhaust yourself. It's tiring. And so the more you can narrow down your selection up front, sort of more efficient you can be in your interview process. So I come up with here just 4 questions that you can ask yourself as you're evaluating the space of possible companies. So the first thing you'll want to ask yourself is, what are you looking for out of this internship or this full-time role? So for some folks, especially if you're early on in your career, the thing you might be looking for out of an internship is you really want to maximize for learning. You really want to go somewhere where you're able to have a lot of mentorship, where you'll be able sort of in a space where that emphasizes learning and even failure as a learning mechanism. And that might be different than somebody who, say, is 5 or 6 years into their career. And rather than learning, they're looking for something to more of a leadership role, or to be in a place where they can have more impact and take on more responsibility. So I'll say that everybody here is different. You might have friends who are also interviewing, and maybe what they're looking for is an opportunity in some specific city, and they really want to be there. And then you say, oh, should I go there too? That's where my friends are going. Not necessarily. Everybody is really, really different. And I think when I was interviewing in college, something that I kind of got bogged down in as well, I think I want this, but my friends are doing all these things that are different, so maybe I should do that too. And the reality is that everybody is really different. And so just ask yourself, what are your goals and what are you looking to get out of your next internship or full-time opportunity? The next question that I would ask yourself is, would you be excited to work with this team every day? You're going to be in an internship or a full-time role, you're going to be working with these people a lot on their mission and on their products a lot. And so I'd make sure that, you're as excited as you can be about that. During the interview process, you'll have a lot of opportunities to meet with different people on the team and hear their stories and ask them questions. And that really is an opportunity for you to get more information about, is this a team that I'd be excited to join? Is their working style something that aligns with my working style? Their goals align with my goals? So it's really a good opportunity to ask yourself that. I think a similar question here is whether or not your values align with the company's values. So in many, many, many tech companies, you can find on their website or on their careers page something with values. And a value is basically something that this company values more than other companies. So for instance, a company value might be something like an early Facebook one was done is better than perfect. And what that communicated was that, we're not a bunch of perfectionists. If you're the type of person who wants to get everything perfectly correct and be super pedantic, then this isn't the company for you, because we're the type of people who are going to get things done just as much as they need to be, sort of maybe 80% of the way there, and then ship it and iterate and get feedback. And that value isn't necessarily good or bad. It's just sort of something the company has decided about their own workflow. And so you can look at that company values and can compare that to your own internal values and say, is this going to be a good fit for me? And the last thing to ask yourself is whether or not this company's size matches what you're looking for. I think I've talked to a lot of candidates in the interview process. Well, I'll ask them, what size company are you looking for? And they'll say, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. I could join a 4-person company or I could join a 4,000-person company. And the answer is it does matter. It's maybe a bad answer to that question. Since your day-to-day experience at a 4-person company, your day-to-day experience at a 4,000-person company, they're just going to be really, really different. No matter how much the large company says, oh, we're just like a small team, or no matter how much a small team says, but we're really organized and stable like a large company. The reality is just there's some things that become possible and impossible at various company sizes. So this is a chart that I really, really like. It's I think it was originally published by Dustin Moskovitz out of Sana, but kind of breaks down startups into these 3 different categories based on how many people are there. So you can see at a small company, mentorship doesn't really exist. You sort of people help you as you need it, but there's no sort of formalized internship program. Your autonomy is just sort of like whatever you got to do, like you figure out what you have to do and then you go and do that. Could involve wearing a variety of different hats, being in a variety of different roles. And then on the other end of the spectrum is a large company where you're going to be hired into a specific role onto a specific team, where maybe you're a back-end engineer hired onto the infrastructure scaling team for the machine learning at this company, which is much more narrow. Your agency there is you're going to have much more clear goals set by the team, set by management. So it's very much not a just figure out whatever you need to do and then do it. It's going to be, here's our team's goals for the quarter. Here are the metrics we're trying to hit. Here are the projects that we think are going to make those metrics possible. And mentorship can be much more formalized. You might be assigned a formal mentor on your first day, have a variety of different support systems, internal documentation, things like that. And again, something I really want to emphasize here is that there's absolutely no right answer. Everybody is really, really different. And as your career progresses, what you're looking for might even change over time. So definitely don't look at this chart and say, oh, the small company is the best or the medium company is the best. It's more about what's the best for you, not sort of the objective correct answer for what to do after you graduate college or what to do as the second company you join in your career. You'll probably read a lot of blog posts on the internet claiming there's some objective truth here, but I promise you there is not. And so it's more about reflecting on what you're looking for yourself. So that's it on choosing companies. I think really the takeaway here is just spend a little bit of time up front narrowing down your search and also reflecting on what you're looking for personally. As we'll see later, a really common question in an interview is, what are you looking for and why would you want to join this team? And so the more you can reflect on that up front, the better you're going to do on those types of questions. So next, we're going to jump into resumes. And the first thing I'll say about resumes is they are not that important. So a lot of people spend a ton of time agonizing over, should this be a M dash or a semicolon in my resume, which is going to get me the job? The answer is that it doesn't really matter that much. I think on average, we've talked to a lot of recruiters. I've been a hiring manager myself. I'd say the average amount of time I spend reading a resume is about 30 seconds. And so as you're creating your resume, really, really optimize for that. The person reading this is not going to spend more than a minute or so reading it. And so what I've done is I've created these 10 resume rules that are all pretty simple. As long as you follow them, you'll probably have a pretty good resume. But before I jump into my rules, I'd love to turn it over to the audience and hear what are some resume tips that you've heard in the past?
Feel free to raise a virtual hand here, or we've enabled the chat in Zoom if you'd like to chime in to everyone via chat. Tommy Martin mentions 1 page. Jessica notes that resumes mean a lot in South Africa. Anna proposes that it be easy to read. Johnny mentions keywords. Rocky mentions targeting for the job. Nisarg mentions concise. Jessica also notes to add skills in it. Abhishek echoes the sentiment that it should be 1 page. Keep it plain, says Pamika. Moaz says 1 page, also nothing too colorful. Concise and clear, not to make it too long. Skills at top, focus on the role you played. Tech stack on top. Clear font has to be concise. I think we can keep going and going here.
Yeah, lots of great advice there. I love a bunch of people piling on the concise, simple, and often takes the form of 1 page. I think if I had to give one piece of advice, it would be that as well. So here are my 10 rules that as long as you follow these, your resume is going to be in good shape. So number 1, 1 page, no exceptions. There's a lot of folks, and again, this is going to vary a little bit by role. So I guess here's an exception to my no exception. If you're in academia, for instance, a really long CV is much more common. But if you're looking for a typical tech job, 1 page, and don't make any exceptions there. The author of Python, the person who created the Python programming language, he used to be at Dropbox, and at some point he published his resume and just said, "Oh, here's what mine looks like," and his is 1 page. And so if the person who created the Python programming language can put all of his achievements and skills onto 1 page, so can you. Number 2, I think folks mentioned this as well, is make it really easy to skim. As I mentioned, the person reading this resume they're not going to spend hours poring over every little detail. And so if you make it really hard to find key information, like what is your name? What is your email? What roles have you had in the past? What are your technical skills? If that's hard to find on your resume, they could just end up giving up on your resume and not sort of taking the time to try to find it. So keep in mind the person reading this, they're trying to go fast, make it easier on the reader of your resume to find important things. Number 3, make your contact info obvious. I've had resumes in the past where I've said, wow, this is great. Some recruiter just passed it along to me. This resume looks great. No way of contacting the person on the resume. There was no phone number, no email, no link to a portfolio, anything. So like, okay, now what do I do? And the recruiter had to go and track them down, which was a pain. So the whole point of your resume is to get in the door and start the interview process. So make sure it's really easy for the company you're applying to actually reach you. Number 4, you want to highlight specific accomplishments. The more specific and concrete your resume can be, the better. So rather than having a line on your resume like improved company metrics, it's really vague. What are the metrics? What does improved mean? Improved by how much? As much as you can be specific on your resume, a line that said, improve the performance of our critical machine learning ranking system by 23% by implementing backend optimizations like improved caching. That was super specific. I gave a metric. I said what the system was. I said what I actually did there. The more specific you can be, the more that a recruiter or a hiring manager can understand what your actual impact was, and that often reflects well on you. I will say that some companies will have non-disclosure agreements where you might be working on a project that hasn't launched yet, or some metrics might be confidential and internal to the company. So certainly don't break any of those non-disclosure agreements, but many times metrics, of the form, improved performance or scaled some system to some number of users. Those are the type of things that are typically public and that you can put on a resume. If you have any doubts, you can also just ask your manager or someone at the internship you're at, just say, hey, this is my resume. Is it okay if I disclose this particular metric. Next, definitely include interesting personal projects. Say, especially for folks who are a little earlier on in their career and might not have experience at multiple companies yet, definitely include personal projects that you've worked on. Maybe that could be an interesting final project for a course. Maybe it could just be something you built in your spare time, but it's something that's great to highlight to show that you have a lot of passion for what you're doing and show off what you're capable of building. I will say I'll caution against if you're able to have a project that's a little more unique and something that you designed yourself compared to many courses have a final project that everyone builds the same thing and it's kind of standard. I would highlight something that you created yourself rather than some kind of standard final project if you're able to. But if you're not, that's okay too. Something here is certainly better than nothing. Next, no charts or ratings. This is maybe my #1 resume pet peeve. A lot of people have on their resume, some chart that says, I'm like a 5 out of 10 at JavaScript and I'm a 7 out of 10 at CSS. To me, this is just a total waste of space. Now, I have no idea what your 7 out of 10 at CSS means. Like, is the inventor of CSS a 10 or is someone with 3 years of experience a 10? It just makes no sense. A lot of people try to do this as a way of, kind of creatively expressing their tech stack. I really don't like it at all. And it doesn't communicate the information you think it's communicating, more likely than not. Next, I would not have a specific objective on your resume. Many resumes I've seen have at the top some objective that says objective : to secure a spot as a software engineer, able to have impact on this company. It's a total waste of space. We know that the objective of you handing me a resume is to get a spot at the company that I work at. So it's a total waste of space. You've only got 1 page to work with. Putting that there doesn't really offer a lot of value. Again, there might be some exceptions here in different industries where maybe it's not actually clear what role you're applying for, but in the case where you've gone through some sort of online application that says, here's the role I'm applying for, or you're talking to a recruiter and it's really clear what role you're applying for, don't waste space with an objective on your resume. #8, use a professional email address. I remember one resume I got, I forget what the person's name is, and they said it was their name, 12345678987654321. And that was the email they used. And I was like, you've got to be, I instantly think less of this person because this is their email. If you're still using the same Gmail address you used and 20 years ago, just create a new one. First initial, last name is great. Last name, first initial is great. Your full name is great. Super easy to create a professional looking email using Gmail or free email service. Definitely do that. Don't have some kind of cute joke email. #9, include relevant links if you have them. So if you have a LinkedIn, a GitHub profile, a personal portfolio, especially if you're sort of applying for a design role, include them on your resume. I think sometimes a hiring manager, before they interview you, they might spend a quick 30, 60 seconds skimming through your portfolio so you'd have something to talk about during the interview. I've certainly clicked on someone's GitHub, saw oh, they created this library for progress bars of the command line. That's kind of cool, and I'll ask them about that during our interview. So that just sort of helps your interviewer understand a bit more about your background. And last, definitely don't sweat the aesthetics and the visuals of your resume. And many times simpler is much better. Simpler is often very easy to skim, but don't worry about things like colors and photos and fonts. Just you can create a really simple resume that gets your point across without having to worry about all of that. So next, I have a couple example resumes, and I'd love to hear from folks in the audience, things that are good and bad about these resumes, taking into account these 10 resume rules. And I will note that these are fake resumes. These are not real people, so we're not roasting anyone on the internet right now. So here is the first one. What do people think? What is good and bad about this?
We've enabled the chat again. If you'd like to chime in to everyone via the chat, feel free to raise a virtual hand and we'll do our best to call on you if you have your video on. Tommy, the answers are starting to fly in here. The skill graph is commented on. Ratings are bad, too hard to read. The skill bar, the rating bar is too much at once in all caps. Bad in a word, hard to find information. Charts and ratings are bad. Using charts, 2 columns are good. More used space. Font, Charts bad, all caps. Bars, skill bars equal bad. Hard to skim, progress bar must not be included. Bad in all caps. I think I'm now encouraging it. And there seems to indeed be a theme developing.
Yeah, so I'll go through a few things about this. So the first thing that I like about this is that under the work experience and education, it's pretty easy to skim there. So I can see they worked as a data scientist. For some reason, in the 2 work experiences, they changed the order of the role in the company. So that's a little weird. But otherwise, I like that it was really easy to see what their experience was, where they worked. The content of the resume here, I'd say it's reasonably specific. I'd say, saying that they collected and studied, interpreted large data sets, they developed new forecasting models. I think that's pretty good. I'd say the part I'd make it a little more specific is if you can be specific about how big the data sets were or exactly what you did to analyze them. I think that would make this a little bit better, but I'd call this reasonably specific. This profile at the top, this top left, I think this is a waste of space. Saying that they're a highly accurate and experienced data scientist. And I look at here and they have 3 years of data science experience. So I don't need to be told how experienced you are. I can sort of look at this from the resume. So I don't think that's a good use of space. And then, I included this one on purpose because it has charts. I don't really know what these charts mean. I don't know if you do either, but this person looks like they're a fantastic team player, but they don't have attention to detail. And so I look at this and say, well, do I want someone who does have attention to detail being a data scientist? I don't know. So I'm not really sure this communicates what they wanted to communicate if this person were a real person. Okay, so that's
Tommy,
resume.
Can I relay a couple of questions now from the chat?
Go for it.
Sergey asks a question about the CV. Do we need to adapt content and keywords for ATS, application tracking systems?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in many companies, they'll have what's called an ATS, which is, as you mentioned, an applicant tracking system. So it might be Lever or Greenhouse, just some software that you apply to. And some of these will kind of look at your resume and filter out for keywords and say, if it doesn't have the word JavaScript, throw it in the trash. So I wouldn't go overly, I wouldn't go crazy and trying to, put every single keyword on your resume. But at the same time, just having a short list of, languages, or technologies you've worked with. I think even I have this on my resume, just sort of listing out the languages you've worked with in the past. If you wanted to have, a little bit of, a little bit of this, or I'm proficient with this language, or I'm new to this language or something, maybe a little bit of that is okay. But in general, just having a quick list that doesn't take up a lot of space is what I'd recommend.
And Tommy, another question was asked, which might vary, I imagine, by country. Pravalika asks, should I add a photograph to the resume?
Yeah, this might vary by country. I would say that if you're applying to a US tech company, I wouldn't do that. Just sort of falls into the same category. It's a waste of space. You can probably change that photo and put much more detail about the impact you had at an internship or a company. But again, this is gonna vary a bit by country, and hard for me to speak to too much outside the US. But within the US, I would definitely not do that.
Okay, I'll continue to chime in, Tommy, as more questions arise.
Awesome. So let's jump to the next resume. Things about this that are good and bad.
Here too, feel free to chime in to everyone in the chat, and we'll do our best to proxy a few questions about this one as well. And as the comments start to come in, Tommy, too long, verbose, too convoluted, too much text. It's a dissertation, unstructured. Is that a page from a novel? Question mark. Hard to read, hard to skim. Looks like a wall of text. Your school email will eventually expire, so I wouldn't use that. Hard to read, very hard to read, hard to skim. It's too much. And there seems here to be a theme. In fact, Jose perhaps says it best. TLDR. Too long, didn't read.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the same reaction I have here. I'll start with the things that I like about this. This sort of middle section here where it says core expertise, I actually like this. If you were, this is sort of an engineering manager, and so their expertise here might be a little bit different, but seeing that they have, experience in vendor relations or, global projects and managing different time zones, that's pretty interesting. If you're an engineer, a data scientist, a designer, this is probably where I'd put your languages or technologies you've used in the past, but this is actually kind of a nice way of maybe the only part of this that's skimmable, but this is a reasonable list where I can quickly skim. But yeah, my main feedback on this resume is basically what everyone else mentioned, is that there's just so much text here. The font is really, really small. It's not really skimmable. To find the companies they worked at is shockingly difficult, even though they're in all capital letters. It's pretty hard to see, where they actually worked. A good thing is that their name and the contact information right at the top, that's nice. But then again, this sort of top section here where they're writing, merging visionary leadership with technical software engineering expertise, my reaction is like, okay, don't need to have that. It doesn't really add any value. So that section at the top could be removed in favor of making this a little bit easier to skim, not having so much text crunched in here. So I'll pause for any questions. Yeah.
Some questions came up from Remington. If I'm a non-CS major, what would be the best way to add courses such as CS50 to my resume, and perhaps massive open online courses outside of college more generally?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd put it in that same section where, languages you've used, technologies you've used, courses you've taken, especially for undergrads or even people making a career shift where they don't have a lot of that experience yet. We'd love to see courses, especially online courses, to sort of show that you've taken the initiative and you've gained some certain set of skills. So I remember when I was an undergrad, I had basically like name, contact, and then languages I know, courses I've taken. I'd say CS50, Introduction to Computer Science, CS61, Systems Programming. And since the course number might not mean something to anybody, so just sort of highlighting the courses you've taken as an undergrad can be great.
And Tommy, a couple of folks, Pragya and Akin, have asked about tools to use when writing a resume. Should they use an online resume maker, LaTeX, Microsoft Word, something else?
Yeah, I would say to use what you're most comfortable with. I was a pretty big LaTeX person in college, and so I was a big fan of that. And so my resume was using that. But I wouldn't recommend I'm going to learn some new tool just for the purpose of creating this resume, since you might be harder than the tool that you already know. So I'd recommend just sticking with what you know already. If you don't know anything yet, even something as simple as Google Docs can produce a pretty good looking resume.
And a formatting question too. A few folks have asked about 2 columns versus 1 column and the use of color or graphics. Your thoughts there too?
Yeah, a little hard to give a kind of a blanket answer there. I would say, write the content of your resume first. The first thing, most important thing is the content, where you work, highlighting those specific achievements, listing out those key skills you have. So do that first, and then, try a few different layouts. I think people with, a ton of experience or a lot of content might, land on a different layout than somebody who is just getting started and doesn't have as much of that yet. So I would say, try a few things, see what looks best for the content that you have. But if your resume is starting to look something like this, just sort of this wall of text, then I would take a step back and reconsider.
Perhaps one final question right now, amalgamated from Harsh and Kyle, who asked questions along the lines of, should your resume be job specific or applicable to any role in tech? And if someone has unrelated experience, for instance, from chemical engineering, should you or how should you include that on a technical resume?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I've seen the spectrum here. When we were at Quora, and also at Serenade, I've seen resumes that are literally like for Serenade, like people who will talk about explicitly Serenade, their background and why it's the right fit for exactly our company. I'd say you can do that. You don't need to. I think if you're applying to 10, 20 companies, doing a good job on 20 different resumes is a lot harder than doing a good job on one resume. So where I would make it specific is for the role, not the company. So if you're applying to an engineering role, try to put as much engineering related experience as possible. If you're applying to a design role and their resume just has a bunch of back-end engineering stuff, I don't know if that makes a ton of sense. I'd try to put in some design side projects you've worked on, or courses you've taken, or projects you've built. And then the question around unrelated experience, I'd say it depends. I think for some people, they've had a career in, let's say, I think you mentioned chemical engineering, and they're looking to make a career transition into another industry. If that's the case, then for sure, show the experience you have, show the impact you've had at companies, and, make it clear to the recruiter or make it clear to whoever you're talking with at the company that, you are making a career pivot. You've worked in this field for, some time, and here's why you're looking to make this pivot, and here's what you're excited about. But definitely don't, submit a blank resume just because the experience isn't exactly in that precise field. At the same time, I think if you're, sort of earlier on in your career and you're an undergrad, I wouldn't just sort of put every club you've ever joined and everything you've ever done on your resume. I'd try to keep it focused to the role you're applying to. So I guess my answer is a little bit different if you're sort of had a career that's several years and you're looking to make a pivot versus you're just starting to graduate college and start to break into tech.
We have an infinite supply of questions, but why don't we let you go on and I'll weave them in?
Yeah, for sure. And we'll make sure it'll save time at the end as well. So that's it on resumes. Like I said, resumes are really just a tool to get your foot in the door. When I say they're not that important, that's basically what I mean is that I've never been in a meeting where we're talking about a candidate and saying, well, they really didn't do well in the interviews, but their resume font was just so perfect. We've got to give them the job. So when I say they're not that important, I mean, once you're in the door, your resume no longer matters. Obviously, your experience does, but the specific typeface on your resume doesn't matter anymore. So that when I say not that important, just to be clear, I don't mean spend no time on it, but I mean that's the extent to which they matter, is that they're getting you into the interview. They're not going to carry you through the whole interview process. So next, let's talk about what to do before the interview. So the first thing I want to talk about is what to expect. So with timing, it's always better to interview early. So especially if you're still in school, whether that's an undergrad or a grad program, try to interview as early as you can. To put concrete numbers on this, for a summer internship starting in May or June, people interview as early as the previous summer. So I've interviewed people in August 2020 for an internship starting in May 2021. I'd say the peak season is around October, November of that year for that following summer internship or following full-time opportunity. So as much as you can, if you can get into that wave, that's great. If you can't, for some reason, something comes up or coursework is there and you have to interview, in let's say February or March for a role starting in June or May, it's still possible, but keep in mind that some companies might fill up their internship class and it might be harder to get a role once a lot of people have already accepted their offers there. So if you can, interview early. If you can't, it's not the end of the world. Also, especially if you're in school, plan interviewing into your schedule. I'm not going to say try to take some easier courses the same time you're interviewing, but if you were to do that, that wouldn't hurt your interview chances. It can be really hard to just assume interviews are like, oh, it's, interview isn't just an hour. You're going to spend a lot of time practicing. The hour is going to be emotionally draining. You're going to be exhausted after that. So just keep in mind that interviewing takes a lot of time and don't sort of think of it as just a couple hour-long meetings you have to worry about. And the last thing I say is look for opportunities that are geared at your experience. So in particular, if you're only taking a few CS courses, you're a freshman or sophomore, maybe if early on in your CS career, there's plenty of internship opportunities out there for you, especially at larger companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft. They have programs explicitly designed for people who just have a few years of experience. So look out for those. Don't apply for the senior manager tech lead role if you only have a year of experience. Try to find the role that's designed for you. You can find these just by looking at the job description. They'll often say, we're looking for 3 years of experience. We're looking for 10 years of experience. We're looking for 0 years of experience. Even if you have 2.8 years of experience and it says 3, still apply for that. But just, if you have 2 years of experience and looking for 10, that's probably not the right role for you. So next, just a bit on the process. So every company is going to have a different process, but these are the things you can probably expect. So the first is some online coding challenge. So many companies, as a first step, they'll send you a link to some site where you can go on and solve some coding problem. Maybe it's timed, maybe you're allowed to run your code before submitting it. I've had things that are just like a Google Doc. They're like, here, just write your code in this Google Doc, and whenever you're done, just let me know. See a pretty wide spectrum here, but that's often a first step. And they'll be really clear with you around what the time limits are, if you're allowed to use external resources or not. And if they're not, just ask whoever gave you the challenge what the constraints are. The next is a take-home interview. So this will usually take the form of, here's some larger project to build. Maybe you're supposed to build it in 2 hours. Maybe they're supposed to build it in 2 days. It's going to vary, but will usually be a bit more on the practical side. Will be, write a little command line app that takes this as input and outputs this, or write a little web application with a login functionality or something like that. So that's another interview type you might expect. The technical phone screen, I'd say, is probably the most common early step in the interview process, where this is what we'll spend the most time on today, is technical phone screen and on-site. Where technical phone screen is often you'll meet with someone over the phone or over video, an engineer or designer or data scientist at that company, and you'll do some technical questions together. We'll ask you to write some code to solve a problem, and you'll share your screen and write that code. And then lastly, on-sites, pretty similar to technical phone screens often. Many on-sites are conducted remotely, so you just do this over video, which makes it almost the same as a technical phone screen. The difference being in an on-site, you'll probably meet with a wider variety of people, solve a wider variety of problems. Maybe you'll do something that's more design-oriented rather than just writing code, and we'll sort of go through those. But these are sort of the 4 types or sort of 4 interview settings you can reasonably expect in the interview process. So next, I want to go through some expectations of you. So before I give you mine, sort of as an interviewer, what I expect of you, I'll turn it over to the audience. What do you think your interviewer expects you to do in an interview?
Re-enable the chat if you'd like to chime in with your answer to that to everyone. Be honest, says Colleen. Tommy. Talk, says Jacob. Communicate well is a theme here too. Good communication skills to behave professionally, says Aisha. Be precise, clear communication, being honest, another theme. Don't say too much specifically. Ask questions to clarify, to know enough about the company, dress up professionally, being smart, smile, ask questions, research the company, explain your own projects well, good info about the job applying, be confident.
Yeah, those are all really good ones. I think in particular around communication is maybe the most important thing. Being able to communicate clearly what you're thinking, how you're approaching the problem is super, super important. So I have a few more specific ones here. So the first thing that I'll be expecting you to do is, and this is related to communication, is be able to think through a problem. So the whole point of an interview is that I'm giving you something that you've never seen before. That's sort of by design, because what I'm looking for is understanding how you would think through this new challenge and how you would tackle some new problem that came up if we were working together. So that's the first thing I'd expect, is your ability to think critically and think through a problem. Second, maybe this is obvious, maybe why nobody said it because it's so obvious, but being able to write code that works. Sometimes that code might not have to be exactly correct, depending on the interview. Maybe some interviewers are just looking for pseudocode rather than perfectly functional code. Your interviewer will tell you what they're looking for here, but looking for you to be able to write code that works. I think if I ask a question that you can only describe like, oh, here's how I would do it, and I say, okay, let's write some code, and you say, I don't know how, that's not great. It happens more often than you might expect. But being able to actually write the code for the solution is something I'd expect. Next thing is I expect you to be able to fix issues. So oftentimes when you're writing code, there are bugs. Being able to fix those bugs, and even better is identifying those bugs yourself. But being, not relying on the interviewer to say, okay, here's your code, here are all the things wrong with it, and here's how I'd fix them. Instead, being able to identify problems with your own code and fixing yourself is something I expect. Reasoning about runtime is really important. So if I say, okay, this code looks like it works, how fast is it? Being able to answer that question is important. You don't have to do all this sort of like, oh, there's all this fancy math that you might want to do, or like write a proof. Really just looking for, is this linear? Is this polynomial? Not anything much more fancy than that. And the last one, which everybody mentioned, is communicate really clearly. So we really expect you to, whether or not you're right or wrong, be able to communicate what you're thinking and why you're thinking that way, and make sure that I, as the interviewer, can understand you. So next, just some types of interviews that you might run into. So the first one is the algorithms interview. So this is an interview where the solution to the problem might only be like 5 or 10 lines of code, but the challenge is figuring out the algorithm and behind those 10 lines of code. So oftentimes in an interview, you might spend like 20 or 30 minutes like talking through cases together, whiteboarding and thinking. And then once you see the algorithm, the process of translating that algorithm into code is usually pretty simple. And you can just do, and sometimes the interviewer might be like, okay, great, let's just like go through this really quick because the interesting part is over because you've figured out the algorithm. The opposite of this is a coding interview where there isn't really any fancy algorithm or any fancy trick. It's just sort of like, hey, we're going to write some code to solve a problem. That code needs to be really clean. You might be writing 50 to 100 lines of code and factoring things out into functions, where the code you're writing might be straightforward, but there are some interesting design challenges or how you'll structure the code. And I will say with these two, your interviewer will probably not tell you up front, like, hey, you're in the algorithms interview now. But many times behind the scenes, companies actually do this when they design an interview loop or sort of your sequence of interviewers. They'll say, okay, the first interviewer, you're going to ask an algorithms question. Second interviewer, you're going to ask a coding question. Third interviewer, you're going to ask something else. So you probably won't be explicitly told this, but you can probably tell within the first few minutes which kind of interview type you're in. But the more important thing here is for our purposes, just making you aware that these different types of interviews exist. If you find yourself writing 5 lines of code and you think you've solved the problem, that might be right. If you find yourself writing 150 lines of code to solve the problem, that might be right too. Next is a practical interview. So these interviews are intentionally designed to be more like real world situations. So rather than whiteboarding some solution to some problem that you probably wouldn't actually run into on a day-to-day basis, these will be write a web application that implements a to-do list. Maybe you're applying to Asana, which is a software that helps you make to-do lists, and they ask you to write a to-do list application. And it's much more practical, right? Because it reflects on the day-to-day work you might actually be doing. So that's another interview type that exists. Another one is systems design. I'll say that these are certainly more common for folks who are more experienced and have designed scalable large systems before. But these will often take the shape of let's say that you are designing the backend for Google Calendar. Tell me about how you would do that. And then the question ends. And it's sort of your job to say, okay, well, first let's talk about the database. Here's the database tables I'd create. And now let's talk about the tech stack I would use. And these are often really, really open-ended on purpose because there is absolutely no right answer. The goal is to just have a conversation with your interviewer and sort of go through the process of creating some system together. So I would say worry about this the least, especially if you're earlier on in your career, because these are often targeted more at folks with more experience, but not crazy that you would get one even earlier on in your career. So just be aware that it exists, but I'd say worry about it the least. And then last is a culture interview. So this will be an interview, or at least one interview, where you'll write 0 code. You'll just talk with somebody. Maybe they're a hiring manager, maybe they're from HR, maybe they're not. They're just some person that you'd be working with on a day-to-day basis. And they'll ask you questions about your prior experience, projects you've worked on in the past, internships you worked on in the past. Maybe they'll ask a question like, when you're at this company, what are some things that the company did well and things you wish the company did better? Or what are some of the biggest mistakes you made? Or what are the biggest things that you learned while you were at this interview? And so the way to prepare for these is really just reflect on your own experience before the interview. Be ready to talk about, if you worked at Google last summer, be ready to talk about that. Talk about the projects you worked on, talk about the obstacles you overcame, talk about the team. Don't be caught off guard if someone asks you, how was last summer? And you're like, oh, I don't know, actually, I haven't really reflected on that. It's really easy to just take some time reflecting on your previous experience and also what you're looking for next. That's sort of the other half of these questions will be, what do you want out of this role? What are you looking for? And remember those questions that we started with, questions to ask yourself before the interview. If you're asking yourself all those questions, you're probably going to be ready for that part of the culture interview because you've picked this company for a reason. And so you're ready to answer.
Tommy, a good question that came in was from Sarah. How do you act if you can't solve a problem or can't write some code? This scares Sarah a lot.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've been there. I think probably everybody has been there. So I would say that if you get a question, you're not sure how to solve it. Well, I'll say most people, when they first get the question, are not sure how to solve it. And so we'll go through this, but the techniques are really about thinking out loud, going through your thought process. You might not be exactly sure, but you can say something like, okay, well, we know this list is sorted, so let's think about the different algorithms for searching a list. There's binary search. Would binary search work here? Well, let's see. And just sort of think out loud like that. And if you hit a wall, which you might hit a wall, hopefully your interviewer will sort of be proactive about guiding you along and giving you hints. But sometimes you just hit a wall and your interviewer is just kind of staring at you, and you can just say, I'm honestly not sure what to think about next. Can you give me a hint or can you help me out? That's much better than just sort of spinning your wheels and just sort of like staring at the wall in silence. Awesome. So going back into preparing for interviews. So definitely don't go into an interview cold. Always, do some practice problems beforehand. The amount of preparation you put into an interview really, really makes a big difference in your success. Some people go so far as to say that interviewing is really just a learned skill. Nobody is good at it by design. Everybody, just the more you practice, the better at it you get. And it's just the skill that you can have by practicing it. So we'll definitely say that the more you practice, the more that is probably going to decrease your stress in the interview as well. Everybody knows that interviewing is, it's really stressful. It's scary. There's a lot of anxiety. The more you've practiced in advance and the more problems you've seen, the more times you've been in this situation with somebody asking you an unknown question and having to think out loud and type, the more you've done that, sort of the more used to it you get, and hopefully the less stressful it becomes. So definitely do a lot of that in advance. The second thing I do in advance is pick a language you're going to interview in, and then do all of your practice in that language. So let's say that you like Python. Great. Learn Python really well. You shouldn't have to Google, how do I reverse a list in Python? Or how do I get the length of a list? Or how do I create a class? If you have to spend any time thinking about that, just creates stress for you, right? Like you just want to have this totally down cold. Don't even worry about how to create a set in Python because you've just memorized it in advance. And I would say that, choose one language, maybe two for some reason, if, maybe you want a back-end language and a front-end language, but you should never be in a situation where an interviewer asks you a question and your first reaction is, what language do I want to use to solve this? Just have this down already and be ready with a language. So some things that you should know how to do in whatever language you pick. One is create a function. Again, this sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people I've interviewed who the first thing they asked me was, how do I create a function again? Or they had to Google how to make a function. You should just know this in advance. Similarly, for defining a class, you might not use a lot of object-oriented programming, but sometimes it can be helpful, depending on what language you're using, to have a class to sort of represent some object or represent some collection of data. So just know how to do that in advance. A lot of interview questions are string-based. And so when I say work with strings, I mean how to create a string, how to concatenate strings, how to index into a string, how to make a string uppercase or lowercase, how to get a substring. Sort of all these different standard library operations with strings, just know them. Again, the more you have to think about, like, is it dot size or dot count? It's just going to make you more nervous. It's going to create stress for yourself. And knowing all this stuff down cold in advance can just make your interview go a lot better. Same thing with lists. Many interview questions take the form, you're given a list. Those are the first 4 words of many interview questions are, you're given a list. And so just being able to be aware of all these different list operations like list slicing or concatenation or removing indexes or pushing and popping, all of those operations you might do to a list. Don't want to be asking yourself, is it push or is it append? I forget. Just know that. Same thing with trees. Another really common interview question is, you're given a binary tree, you're given some sort of tree, just do some sort of traversal on it. So being able to write depth first search or breadth first search, even create a tree in whatever language you're in, just knowing how to do that in advance is going to save you a lot of trouble. So next, around complexity, we mentioned that many interviewers will just ask you after you've written code, what's the complexity of this code? It's pretty rare. I'll say it's not impossible, but pretty rare that, the complexity they're looking for is n cubed plus n factorial over something. It's usually just going to be, is it linear? Is it polynomial? Is it exponential? And that's probably it. So being able to have these down cold is really helpful, whether something's constant, log, linear, polynomial, or exponential. Just knowing these 5 and being able to identify, is your code one of these 5? That's going to get you through the vast majority of what interviewers are looking for when they say, what's the complexity of your solution? So the next thing I'll say is to build up your toolbox. So many interview problems are kind of fancy ways of phrasing or framing the same few core concepts. So here are a few. So one is recursion or divide and conquer, basically taking some large problem, being able to split it up into smaller subproblems and then solving those smaller subproblems. So as you're doing practice problems, be really familiar with recursion. And I think recursion is something that for many people is really scary, especially if you're early on. So if it is scary for you, just practice it. You don't want to be caught in a situation where you get a problem that is probably should be solved recursively, but you're uncomfortable with recursion. So the more you practice it, just the more comfortable you're going to be. Definitely don't be put in that situation because you just didn't want to practice recursion. Next one is graph searches. We mentioned this with trees. but many problems just reduce to just model this thing as a tree or a graph and then just do a search over that tree. So being able to practice writing depth first search or breadth first search, just do it a few times in advance to make sure you're comfortable with it. Greedy algorithms is another one. As you're sort of looking around at interview practice problems, this is often a category. So just being able to practice these and recognize when something might be there. Talked about strings. That's just many problems are just string manipulations at the end of the day. So really, as you're practicing, you should be building up this toolbox as you go and just be familiar with all of these concepts. And searching and sorting is another really common one. How do I sort this array efficiently? Given a sorted array, how do I search it efficiently? And dynamic programming. This one's a little more advanced, but if you're taking algorithms classes, dynamic programming is basically a way to speed up algorithms and sort of cache the results of problems as you're solving them. So some tools you have at your disposal. So when you get a problem, you should really think about what tools do I have? What sort of core algorithms do I know? What are some core data structures that I know? And then try to pattern match which of these data structures or algorithms fits this problem. So one is arrays or linked list. Be really comfortable using arrays, understanding what a linked list is, and understanding what problems should fit into a linked list or an array. Hash table is another super common one. You can sort of ask yourself, okay, given this problem, can I model this as a hash table? Does that therefore like instantly speed up my runtime? Binary search is another one. Many problems that take the form of find X or given a list, look for something can be reduced to a binary search problem. So just be aware of that. And maybe that should be your first check if you get a search problem is, can I model this as binary search? Shortest path algorithms are another one. I think, given that we mentioned these a few times, but given some tree, how do I search through that tree efficiently? And memoization, which is similar to dynamic programming, but once I've solved a problem, can I reuse that solution to solve some larger problem? And we'll go into some examples of this once we get into the mock interviews. So some more general advice, as you're practicing, try to really simulate the environment accurately. So something that I know I do when I'm practicing is I sort of look at a problem and I'm like, oh yeah, I think I can basically see it. And then I'll look at the answer and be like, oh yeah, I could have done that. But then if I try to, force myself not to look at the answer, I'm like, oh, actually, I don't see it at all. So really simulate that environment accurately. If you know your interview is going to be 45 minutes, put a 45-minute timer on your interview. If you know the interview is going to be on a coder pad or it's going to be on a whiteboard, practice on a whiteboard or pen and paper. And as you're doing that practicing, look for patterns. Everybody's different. Some people are really great at recursion. Some people are really bad at it. So if you've done 10 practice problems and you found that you got them all right, except for the 3 recursion ones, go practice more recursion. Everybody is going to be different in what they're skilled and not skilled at. And so really look for patterns in your own approach. And then lastly, if you can, practice with friends. It can be fun to sort of go through practice interviews with, you being the interviewer or your friend being the interviewer, and you sort of going through that problem. What this does is just simulates the environment and makes it even more familiar so that once you're in that situation of being on a real video call, writing real code on a Google Doc, it's not the first time you've done that. You're sort of used to it. It's really familiar to you. So now some tips for during the interview. So all of that was sort of what you should do in advance, preparing for the interview. And so now we're going to jump into the Google Meet just started, the Zoom call just started. What do we do? So throughout this, what I really want to emphasize is that the most important thing for your interview is your process, not your output. I've been in many interviews where the person did not get the correct answer, but we hired them, and many interviews where the person did get the correct answer and we did not hire them. And the reason was their process was significantly more important. If you can demonstrate that you're thinking really critically and that you're able to reason through a problem and find issues with your solution and optimize it, even if you don't get to a perfectly correct answer, that's so much more important than somebody who isn't able to communicate, who isn't able to think critically, but is able to write correct code just because they've seen the problem before, or they got lucky, or maybe they did understand the problem, but their communication wasn't there. And so, it isn't something that you want to hire onto your team. So throughout all this, really emphasize that it's not the most important thing to get the perfect answer. That obviously helps, but your process is so much more important than what you produce. So the interview will start. The interview won't start with just a problem on the board and someone will say go. But have your interviewer there. They'll probably introduce themselves and ask you to introduce yourself. Something I like to do before the call starts is just take a deep breath and relax. Tell yourself that it's going to be okay and that every interview is is stressful and everybody hates them. So take a deep breath, relax. Have an intro prepared, just like a minute or two. Like, hi, I'm Tommy, originally from Boston, worked at Quora for 6 years on back end. I'm looking for my next role, looking to transition into a front end role because I want to have a lot of impact there. And I think that space is really interesting right now. Done. Just doesn't have to be super fancy. But if someone says, hi, introduce yourself, and you're sort of like scrambling and you don't have an introduction ready, so getting yourself off on the wrong foot. So just have something ready. They might also ask you, tell me about the recent project you worked on. Have a quick 3 minutes ready to go there, but don't ramble. This is meant to take 3 to 5 minutes. Just make sure everybody feels comfortable. So if you're introducing yourself for 30 minutes, which I've had people do, you're probably doing it wrong. And then you'll get the problem. So after the intros, the interviewer will give you the problem that you're going to solve. First thing, don't panic. You're going to get a problem. You're probably not going to know the solution off the top of your head. That's expected. Don't freak out. If you have seen the problem before, tell your interviewer that. So maybe you just practiced some like palindrome problem on LeetCode last night. And your interviewer says, given a string, tell me if it's a palindrome. Just tell them if you've seen it. Or if you've seen something similar, just say, oh yeah, I've seen, I was actually, this is one of the problems I practiced last week. So I have seen this one before. They might say, okay, great. Thanks for telling me. Let's solve a different one. They might say, okay, that's fine. Let's just solve it anyway. Like, even if you've seen it before, like, I still want to see your approach. It's up to the interviewer what they want to do there. But the thing to not do is be dishonest. I catch people all the time being dishonest. One way to get caught is we sometimes in an onsite, 2 interviewers on this, talking to the same person will ask the same question because they forgot to like share what questions they asked. And then the second time the person will be like, oh, I haven't seen this before. Let me solve it. It's just like an instant rejection. Unless you're an Academy Award winning actor, you'll probably get caught trying to act. So just be honest. Don't try to do anything, sneaky here. Just let your interviewer know if you've seen the problem. After you get the problem, let's say, you've disclosed if you've seen it before. After that, the first thing you probably want to do is ask clarifying questions. Really good clarifying questions are of the form, okay, so let me just be clear. So if this was the input, then this would be my output. And they'll say, yes, it is. And you say, okay, great. You're sort of on the same page. You've understood the problem. Then as you're solving it, always think out loud. You should basically, as an interviewer, never be silent for more than like 30 seconds or 60 seconds at a time. It's going to feel really weird to constantly just be thinking out loud because that's not how most developers or data scientists or designers think. They just sort of like think in their head and not speaking. Your interviewer will expect you to do this. It will feel weird if you've never done it before, but it is what you're supposed to do. Sometimes you might say, okay, do you mind if I just take a minute to think or draw something out on a piece of paper? Your interviewer will say, sure. But if you're sitting there in silence for 5 minutes, typing away at your keyboard and not making much sense, your interview is not going well. If you can, try talking through multiple possible approaches. Usually when you're given a problem, you might have a couple ideas for how to solve it and talk through all of them. You can say, okay, I have a couple ideas here. One idea is to build a graph that has these as nodes. Another idea would be to create a hash table where this is the key and this is the value. Sort of explain it out loud. Your interviewer is probably going to help you here and say, oh, okay, yeah, those both might work. If I were you, I'd go with the second one. You can say, okay, great. Now I'm going to go with the second one. You're sort of making it more of a conversation and giving your interviewer an opportunity to help you. Many folks are sort of visual folks. So feel free to draw a diagram. Even if you're doing this over video, having a little whiteboard or a piece of paper handy, that can be helpful if you're a visual person. So if you want to draw the diagram, hold it up to the webcam if you want or not, depending on sort of what the situation is. But to sort of have the supplies ready if you think you'll need them. Then after you got the problem, you've articulated some solutions, what you really want to do is try to pattern match, right? We mentioned that most interview problems sort of reduce down into a really small number of core concepts like search problems, strings, graph problems. So try to pattern match against what you know to what you think this problem is getting at. So for instance, maybe someone's described something where you're searching for something that could be a bunch of different possibilities. Ask yourself, okay, could we formulate that as a search? Or maybe somebody has described some problem and you're like, okay, well, maybe there's some recursion here that I can formulate, or maybe binary search is applicable. But take all those things we talked about earlier in your toolbox, like lists, strings, trees, hash tables, and just sort of go through them in your head. Does a hash table apply here? Does a list apply here? Does a tree apply here? Hopefully the answer to one of those is yes, and that can really help kickstart your solution and kind of get you off the ground. And then you sort of figure out, why is it a graph problem, or how is this different than a standard graph search? But it can help get you to a starting point for your solution, rather than trying to invent some new algorithm on the spot or derive something totally new on the spot. Pattern match against what you know, and you know a lot because you sort of went through all of the toolbox and prep you should be doing in advance. As you're writing up your solution, try to write general code before really specific code. And what I mean by that is, let's say that your interview problem is, write a function to compute a factorial. What some people do is their first instinct is they say, well, I know the factorial of 3 is 6. So I'm going to say if input equals 3, return 6. And then they come up with like 3 or 4 corner cases first. I would say don't do that. That code is probably not going to last. You're going to end up deleting it. But it can also sometimes create this mental block where you fail to see this general solution because you're zoomed in on like a small number of cases work. So try to think about this generalized solution and then find corner cases, rather than enumerate all the possible corner cases and then try to find some general solution. For the most part too, if it feels like your solution is really complicated, like it's got a bunch of corner cases and a bunch of branching and like 4 different helper functions, if it just feels pretty complicated, it probably is, and there probably is a simpler solution. Sometimes there's not, and it's kind of hard to tell, but your interviewer is probably going to be there asking you to simplify it, or maybe there's a better way. But just as a heuristic for yourself, if you're looking at your code and you're like, wow, that's a lot, it feels really messy, it's not because like, ooh, the problem is so hard. It's probably because your solution is overly complicated. To get at a question that we asked earlier, if you get stuck, ask for help. It's much better to say, honestly, I'm a little bit stuck here. Can you give me a hint, or can you point me in the right direction? Saying that is so much better than just staring at a wall for 30 minutes and getting nowhere on the problem. It's obviously better if you solve the problem without asking for hints. Someone who's constantly asking for hints and needs a lot of hand-holding to get to the answer, that's not a good interview either. But sometimes you do hit a wall, you can ask a question, and with a small little hint, you can get unstuck, and then you're back off to the races. And also make sure before you type a single line of code, explain your solution. Be aligned on what you're about to write before you write it. You don't want to create some situation where you've written a bunch of code, in the back of your head, your interviewer is like, they didn't even tell me what they're trying to do. I didn't even know what they're trying to do, and this is like super wrong, and you don't have enough time to fix it, and then your interview's over, you lose. So make sure you're aligned on the same page of what code you're about to write and what your general approach is before you go and write it. And again, this is what I mean when I say process, not output. If you're aligned in an approach and you're thinking critically and you're communicating well, maybe your output isn't perfect, but that's what we're really looking for a good interview. Okay, some few last tips before we get into the mock interviews here. So as you're writing code, constantly communicate. Sometimes I'll even kind of like narrate the code I'm writing. I'll say, well, first I'm going to create a function called cache, and then that's going to take 2 parameters. It's going to take the key, and then it's going to take the size of the cache. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a base case here. Just that kind of communication is really helpful as you're typing. Again, it feels weird, it's unnatural. Practice it. I promise that's what your interviewer wants you to be doing. Next thing is always get something working. Sometimes people will see some simple or naive solution. They know it's not optimal. And rather than writing out the naive solution, they sit there and they're like, no, I don't want to write anything until I get the perfect optimal solution. Then they end the interview having written 0 lines of code. Really good chance that the interview didn't go well. You're not going to move forward. Definitely better to have something than to have nothing. Once you have something, then go ahead and try to simplify, make optimizations, and get to that optimal solution. But even if you can't ultimately get to the optimal solution, but you're thinking really critically, you're communicating well, maybe with like 5 more minutes you would have got there, that's a really good interview outcome. Last, listen to your interviewer. I've had many candidates who do not listen to me as I'm trying to help and give hints. Your interviewer wants you to succeed. As an interviewer, like it's so much less fun, like watching somebody struggle and you're trying to help and they're telling you like, no, you don't understand the problem you just gave me. It's like, I probably do, and I want you to succeed. So if your interviewer is sort of like giving you little hints and guiding you in the right direction, really listen to what they're saying and take it seriously. Really, really rare that some interviewer is going to like intentionally try to fool you or give you some hint to lead you down the wrong direction and be like, oh, is that your final answer when it's actually correct? Like it's pretty rare. I'd assume the interviewer is not doing that unless, they've already done it once or something. So really listen to your interviewer. They want to help you. Take advantage of that and listen to their feedback. Oftentimes people ask, what code do I write? What we're looking for specifically is a function that returns the answer. So don't just write a linear, if the first line of code shouldn't be like if this, and assume some variable exists. The first line you write should be creating a function that will ultimately return the answer. If that function needs to be more than one function, great, decompose that into separate functions as needed. Don't go crazy here and make sure you have something working before you spend a bunch of time refactoring code and cleaning it up. A lot of good, sort of general engineering and programming principles apply here too. Don't create variable names with crazy acronyms or abbreviations. Make sure everything is readable. If you have common logic, factor things out into helper functions. Again, this is all about the process. If you're doing this and demonstrating these things, that's way more important than your function being perfect at the end. Last part is testing it. Once you have written code, your job now is to be a computer. So take your code and run through it line by line. Execute the code as if you were a CPU. Make sure that if you run the code, it's going to end up returning the correct answer. And again, do that out loud. So what I would say is, let's say you have that factorial function saying, okay, well, let's try passing in 3. Well, it's 3. My base case is checking if it's equal to 1. 3 is not equal to 1. So let's move on to the next line. We're going to enter this recursive case and just walk it through and make sure that you get the correct answer at the end of it. As you're doing this, be on the lookout for bugs. Sometimes, you can, in your head, what the code is doing is different than what's actually written. So as best you can, do exactly what the code is actually doing, and that's going to help you find bugs. And just verbally reason about that out loud and walk through, sort of narrate the process of this function executing to your interviewer. Sometimes in an interview, you'll be given a computer and the ability to run code. Sometimes you won't, either because it's on a whiteboard or because the interviewer says you're not allowed to run code. I want to see your reason about it. And the mock interviews we're about to do, we will be allowed to run code on the computer. So if you can do that, I advise to, write a few test cases if you can. Maybe they're just like print statements at the end or something that's going to run the code and verify the output is correct. But what I wouldn't do is when you're given the ability to run the code is kind of like take advantage of that just by like running it a million times and like, let's say you have an off by 1 error somewhere, just sort of randomly adding +1s and -1s and then running it until eventually you get the correct answer. Even if the answer is correct, that's a great example of a process that is not good. We want to see you reasoning about things and arriving at a solution confidently rather than just sort of randomly lucking your way into a solution. And the ability to run code a bunch can be this temptation that can lead to that kind of outcome. And last, if you can add, print statements or sort of debug the state as your code is executing, definitely do that. I think sometimes people will run the code, look at the output, say that's wrong, change something, look at just the output and say that's wrong. We're printing out intermediate state and what your code is doing along the way. Maybe you have a recursive function. You're going to print every time the recursion is called, print the input so you can make sure the sort of stack is what you think it's going to look like. And that's usually the most effective way to fix issues. And again, I'll say it one last time, the process matters way more than the output here. Okay, so let's jump into some mock interviews. So what we'll do is we'll have Connor and Maria will be the interviewee. I will be the interviewer. And we'll try to simulate this really as realistically as we can. So there's, like I said, these are real problems I've really given in the past at real tech companies. And then Connor and Maria have done lots of real interviews. And so they'll give you what a real performance looks like, just so you can sort of take a look at how things go. So I'll read the problem first, and then we'll flip into screen sharing and start the interview. So this is the first problem that we're going to be working on. So I'll read it out. So let's define a rotated array as a sorted array where the numbers have all been rotated to the right some number of places with numbers wrapping around when they reach the end. So for instance, if you've got the array 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you rotate that 3 times, you're going to get 3, 4, 5, 1, 2. So the problem here is given a rotated array, find the number of times it was rotated. So I will stop the screen share here.
And I will go ahead and start sharing mine.
Perfect.
And just to verify, everyone can see a Replit screen up on theirs.
Yes, indeed.
All right, perfect. All right, well, hi, Tommy. How are you doing? I'm Connor.
Good. Nice to meet you, Connor. How's your day going?
It's going pretty well, and yours?
Awesome. Not too bad. It's pretty sunny out here in San Francisco, which doesn't happen too often.
That's great. Yeah, it's pretty warm out here for October in Cambridge.
Nice. All right. Well, thanks for taking the time. Let's jump right into the question. So you've got the Replit open. That's great. Notice that you've selected Python there. Is that the language that you want to use for this?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. That works for me. So here's the question that I'd like you to solve. So let's define a rotated array as a sorted array where the numbers have all been rotated to the right some number of places with numbers wrapping around when they reach the end. So for instance, if I give you the input 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you should return back 3. When I rotate that 3 times, you should return back 3, as basically as you've written in the comment there. So that's the question that I'd like you to solve.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. So I'll start out by asking some clarifying questions, if that sounds good to you.
Yeah.
So just to make sure, it does say given a rotated array here. I just want to clarify that something like this right here would be our input. So I don't get this original array at all. I just get the rotated array as input.
Yep, that's right.
All right. And then my other clarifying question is, in this one, all of these are consecutive integers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all right next to each other. Can I assume that will be the case, or there be a case like where my original array is like 1, 3, 4, 7, 10?
Yeah, so that could exist. So they're not necessarily consecutive, but they are sorted.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. All right. In that case, let me just look at a couple of examples just so I can see if we can start to see a pattern here.
Sure.
So we see when we get this first example, we want that to map to 3 because we're rotating that one 3 times. Let me see if I were to rotate that one more time, then it would look like 2, 3, 4, 5, 1. And so that would be as if I had rotated it 4 times. And then I'll try some ones with different numbers. So if my original array has like some different numbers in it, it might look like a rotated one might look like 6, 8, 12, 1, 3. And in this case, we would have rotated it. So 1 would have been the original one. And so we've rotated it 1, 2, 3 times. So we would also want this one to return 3.
Mm-hmm.
And then just one more kind of like edge-ish case is if it's not sorted at all, I'm assuming that we would want to say that was rotated 0 times.
Yes, that's right.
All right. So just to check in, do all of those cases seem good to you?
Yeah, nothing else you'll probably run into here.
All right, great. So in that case, let me go ahead and run through looking for patterns so I can see like just how I would figure this out if I was looking through this as a human is I would like go to the first one. And I guess the important thing I'm looking for is all of these numbers are increasing. And I want to look for like the first time that they decrease. So they start going down. So like in this case, I go to 0, I go to 1, it's increasing. I go to 2, it's increasing. And then when I get to element 3, it's decreasing, which means it's rotated 3 times. Okay, so and then just to verify that, I'll go through this one. So in this one, I start at element 0, then 1, it's still increasing, 2, still increasing, 3, still increasing, but at 4, it decreases again. So I think that is a pretty good pattern to use there, is that when we get to an index, when it starts decreasing, that's the index that we want to return.
Yeah, that looks exactly right to me. That's that point where it goes from increasing to decreasing is the index that tells you the number of times it's been rotated.
All right, perfect. In that case, I think I'll go into writing some code if that sounds good to you.
Yeah, let's do that.
All right, so I'll go ahead and define a function here. And so like, I guess I'll just say like get rotate number.
Sure, sounds good.
And it's going to take in this array. That looks like it might be reserved. So I'll take in a list, ls. And now I want to go through all of the elements in ls. So, and the index is important here. So I guess I'll go ahead and say for I in range ls. And now what I want to do is for each I, like when I'm here, I is 2, I want to compare it to the one before that and see if it's less than that. So let me, I guess I would say something like if ls bracket I is less than ls bracket I minus 1. So we're saying if my current element is less than the element before that, then I would go ahead and I know that that's the place that I want to stop. So I can go ahead and say return I. And now looking at this special case here where nothing happens, I guess I would go through this entire list and never get to that point. So I guess if I finish this whole thing, so I don't find any point where an element is less than its predecessor, I'm going to go ahead and return 0, since I know that the list is not doing it, is not rotated at all. So now just as a sanity check, I'm going to go through this with this first example here. So acting as the computer, I take in ls, which is this list I've highlighted. And then I go ahead and say for I in range ls. So that's going to start me off at 0. And I'm going to say if ls bracket 0, which is 3, is less than ls bracket 0 minus 1 is going to be ls bracket -1, which is this 2 here, which I guess will not be a problem here, because if 3, the only case when this first element is going to be less than the last element is when the array is not rotated at all. So I would want to return 0 in that case. So that actually makes me think that I may not need this return 0 at the end here. Just kind of a peculiarity of Python indexing, where if I say ls bracket -1, it's going to be the last element of the list instead of giving me an error like it might in C or Java or some other programming language.
Yeah, makes sense. I hadn't thought of that, but I think you're right.
All right. So, and then going through that example, for this one, it would start out at 0 and see that it is, in fact, 3 is in fact greater than 2. So it'll continue. It'll get to this one. It'll say that 4 is greater than 3. So it'll continue. It'll get to 5, say 5 is greater than 4. So it'll continue. But then when I is 3, we'll see that ls bracket I is in fact less than ls bracket I minus 1. So we'll go ahead and return I, which is 3, which is as expected. So just running through it like as a human, that seems to work. So now let's move on to writing some tests.
Yeah.
So I can go ahead and say, I'll just print one out first to verify. So I'll go ahead and say print get rotate numbers of our first list here. And hopefully this will end up with 3. So I can go ahead and run my code here. And we've got a problem here where I'm saying list object cannot be interpreted as an integer. Oh, okay, and I think what's going on here is I can't just say for I in range list, because range has to take in an integer. So I actually have to look at the length of the list here.
Yeah, that's right.
Instead. So now I'll go ahead and try that again. All right, nice. And so that's looking pretty good. So that's looking like it's printing 3. And then I'll just go ahead and try with our other lists here. So hopefully this second one should translate to 4. This third one should translate to 3. And this last one should translate to 0. And we'll go ahead and run that. And it looks like I added, oh, I forgot a
just the
bracket here.
There.
I'll run that. And it looks like that is giving us the result we want. So that's looking pretty good to me. So I guess I'll check in at this point and see if there's anything that you notice about this or any other corner cases you think I should try out.
Yeah, this looks right to me. What is the runtime of this?
Yeah, of course. So going through the runtime, since I'm going through I in range length of ls, I'm going to go through this loop a maximum of n times if there's n elements in ls. And then just accessing elements of a list in Python is O of 1, and comparing to integers in Python is going to be O of 1 in terms of the size of the list. And so this whole operation inside the for loop is going to be constant time. So I'm going to say that the entire runtime is going to be O of n. So if there are n elements in the list, it'll take a maximum of n times.
Yeah, I think that's right. Can you think of any ways to make it faster?
Yeah, let's see. So if I'm working on making it faster, I wonder, So I guess any way that we could make it faster would be to, I'm actually a little bit unsure, because I like going through it as a human, I can't think of anything else I would do than go through each element. So I'd love to know if you have any hints, if you could nudge me in the right direction a little bit.
Yeah, so keep in mind that the list is sorted. Even though it's rotated, we have this property that it's sorted. So is there any search we could use that leverages the fact that it's sorted?
We could use, so generally with a sorted list, we could use just a binary search. So if we're going through and doing that, then how would I apply a binary search to this problem? So I guess I could, let's see. So if I go through kind of the motions of doing a binary search with a problem like this, I would start in the middle and see that I've got of size 5 here. Okay, so I guess I would have to look at the first element first, see that my first element is a 3. And then when I head to the middle, I see that I'm at size 5, which means that whenever that it's been increasing since then, which means I guess I can, at that point, I can go ahead and narrow my search down to the latter half of the list after I've checked that one. And vice versa, if I, let's say for, what's a good example for this one? If I start at, or I guess I don't have a great example for that one, but if I were to get to a point where I was like checking this 3 here, then I would know, like, if I'm checking at this 3, I know I can just look at everything before the 3. So yeah, I think a binary search would be able to help us out there. Just want to check in time-wise. Is it all right if I go ahead and try and implement that, or do you think we should move on?
Yeah, let's try to implement it quickly, and then if we're out of time, that's totally fine.
Yeah, sure. So let me leave this other one here just to have something to reference. And now this newer version here, I don't necessarily want to go through each I in this range. I want to go ahead and say my let's see, I only care about when I'm going from a high number to a lower number. So I'll go ahead and say that my highest number that I've seen so far is going to be the first element in the list is ls bracket 0. And then I can go ahead and say that my lowest element that I've seen so far is we can go ahead and look at the last element of the list, because I know it's going to be somewhere between, or I guess we don't necessarily know that's the lowest. Let me think about how we would want to initialize those. So 5, if that is the lowest, then yeah, I guess I'll just start out with 0 and go through kind of the logic of this. And then, although I think I'm going to actually want, so if I'm looking for an item that is lower here, I'm also going to want to keep track of the indices that I'm working with.
Mm-hmm.
Does that seem like it's going to be on the right track?
Yeah, I think in general, you'll probably want to look at sort of the keep track of the sort of left and right endpoints of the search, and then you can compare wherever you land on in the middle to those left and right endpoints.
Yeah, that's a good point. So let me go ahead and say that like left for now is going to be 0, the like first index. And then since we're starting our search with the whole list, our right is going to be the length of the list -1.
Mm-hmm.
And then what I can go ahead and say, like, I can go ahead and instead of having this whole for loop here, I can say while right is greater than left. So like while we're still working on converging in, then I'll go ahead and say that my current index is going to be equal to right plus left divided by 2. Let me get some parentheses in there. And so that will take the middle element. And then since we're working in Python, I realize I should probably do some integer division here.
Yep.
So that'll get us our current index that we're working with. And then I can go ahead and say, and then let me look at this example to see what we should do. So in this example, if our current index is greater than the index on the left, then I know I can narrow my search to the right half. So if ls bracket current, so if that current number is greater than ls bracket left, it's greater than the left number, then I can go ahead and I can narrow down the search to this right half of the list. So I can go ahead and say that left equals current. And then I can go ahead and say, otherwise, if ls bracket current is less than ls bracket left, then I can go ahead and say right equals current. So I know that we are going ahead and changing our rightmost there. And so now we just kind of have to work on what happens after we do narrow in on that case. So let's go through the example with this top one again. So we get to this point with this 5 here. And so now we know that our difference is going to be between 5 and 2. And actually, now that I'm thinking of, yes, we're looking between 5 and 2 here. So our left is at this point is going to be 2, and our right is going to be 4. And so now our central one is going to be 1 here. And so now, since 1 is less than 5, we would hit this case. And so we would say right equals current. So now our left is going to be 5 and our right is going to be 1. So we know that we're ending here when our right one is just 1 more than our left one. And so let me go through what the example would do in this. If left is 2, as we have here, and right is 3. So when left is 2 and right is 3, our current is going to be 3. And so this is going to say if current is greater than the left one, which isn't true because they're the same thing. And then we'll say if current is less than the left one, which isn't going to be true because they're the same, then we can have an else statement here. And if it's an else, then we know that this current one is kind of one below where we want to do. So we can try and return our right here. So now just running through with another example as kind of a sanity check. So we'll take this one here. Let's say our left is 0 to start, right is 4. We can find the one in the middle, which is going to be element 2. And then we're going to see that 2 is greater than our left. So that means that we're going to narrow our search down to these last 3 elements here. And now we're going to go ahead and say that, so now we're going to go ahead and find the middle element here, which is 1. And we'll say that left, so this is our current, and then we're checking, is current greater than left? No, that's not true. Is current less than left? Yes, that is true. So we're changing our current to this, or we're changing our right to this. And so now we're just looking at this section here. These are our left and right. And when we compare left to current and right to current, they're both going to be the same thing. So we get this else here, and we return what's on the right, which is 1, which should be correct. So just basic conceptually wise, it looks like things are working out here. So let me run through it real quick with the unrotated array to see how things are going there. So in this case, we're going to get to this middle one. We're going to see that right is greater than, the current is greater than left. So we'll get to this one here now, and we'll see that the right is still greater than the left. So now our current is still greater than the left. So our left is becoming this one. And now we're going to go ahead and say the left is still going to be this one. So that's not going to give us the right answer here, it looks like.
Yeah, I think the stop condition you're looking for is sort of in that first example. You can see with the 1, the number to the left is bigger and the number to the right is bigger. So that's kind of the stop condition for your search. Otherwise, though, I think the binary search is right.
Okay. Yeah, so that makes sense. So maybe I can go ahead and check that condition. So like if we're looking at our current one, we would do you think for each time we would look at our current and check if it's smaller than the left one but smaller than the left one and smaller than the right one?
That seems right.
Okay, sure. So if we're already checking if our current is smaller than the left one here. And so I can go ahead and nest a little bit of ifs here and say, like, if our current is also smaller than the one, sorry. But we're not looking at direct neighbors there. So let's look at direct neighbors up here. So that would look like if ls bracket current -1 is less than ls bracket current, which is less than ls bracket current +1, which is a nice thing we can do in Python, is just combine these different inequalities. And I'll take away those parentheses for now. And so in this case, we know that current is the one that we want to return. So we can go ahead and return current here. And then let me just do another sanity check with these.
Yeah, I think this looks basically right. Just for time, we're basically at time. But yeah, overall, this search looks pretty good.
All right.
Awesome. Well, thanks for taking the time for chatting with me today, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks. It was great to meet you.
Awesome. See you later.
Bye. And then for feedback, is it best to keep my screen shared?
Let's actually just switch to Maria just for time's sake. So Maria can
Sure.
flip into screen sharing and we can go into the next question.
Okay, beautiful. Can everyone see my screen properly?
Yes.
Awesome. Hey, Tommy, how are you?
Awesome. How's it going?
Good. How's your
Good.
day going?
I'm good. It's a sunny day still in San Francisco, so I'm loving it.
Beautiful. It's kind of a gloomy day in New York, but still pretty warm, so I'll take it.
Nice. Well, thanks so much for jumping on the call. Let's jump into a coding problem.
Awesome. Cool.
All
So,
right. So it looks like you've got the replit set up. Notice you're set to Python. Is that the language you'd like to use?
yep, that's language I'd like to use if that sounds good with you.
Perfect. That's good with me. All right. So I'll describe the problem and then you can take it away from there. So what we're going to do is, given a string, we're going to be looking for the length of the longest substring without repeating characters. So for instance, if I gave you the string ABC, ABC, BB, the length of the longest substring there is 3. So there's ABC where it doesn't have any repeating characters in there, and there's a few other ones like that. So your function would take that as input and then just return the length of that string, which is 3. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. That's great. Cool. Just thinking through this question a little bit, I guess a few clarifying questions.
Yeah.
So we just want to find the length, right? We don't care about returning like one or all of like the subsequences that match that length.
Yep, that's right.
Awesome. Cool. And then when it comes to the input, I see the example we have here is all lowercase characters. Should we assume that we're going to get all lowercase characters as input, or do we want to handle kind of like sanitizing that input a little bit?
Yeah, that's a good question. You can assume the input's all lowercase.
Awesome. Cool. And I guess could the input be empty, like the empty string?
It could, in which case you return 0.
Awesome. Cool. Great. I think that covered all of my questions. So maybe then just to give a few examples. So ABC, ABCDB, the answer would be 3, the output that we want to give. If we have all repeating characters, the output would be just 1, I'm assuming.
Yep, that's right.
Awesome. And conversely, if we have all different characters, the output would be 6 in this case.
Yep.
And then, as we said, if we get the empty string, the output would be 0. Yeah, awesome. I think that makes a lot of sense. When I'm kind of like looking at this initial string and problem, I guess the first instinct that I have for like the very naive solution is that, kind of brute force, we can just get all of the possible like subsequences or substrings and check whether there are any duplicate characters within those substrings. So in the ABCBB example, that would be first starting with every substring starting with A would be A and checking if that has any repeating characters. Then AB, it doesn't have any duplicate characters. Then ABC, it also doesn't have any duplicate characters. Then ABCA, which has duplicate characters. And then every single one, ABC, AB, would also have duplicate characters given that the substring of that had them, and also that B is repeating, similar with ABC, 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 ABCB, and ABC, ABCBB. So it would be a very similar case if we started B and it's C. So it's kind of making me feel like the naive solution, we'd be kind of doing a little bit of like work that is not useful. So if we could avoid that, that would be great. Reasoning a little bit over like that naive solution, brute force approach, going through all possible subsequences would be quadratic time. And then within that, checking whether there are duplicate characters within each substring would be linear time. So in total, that probably would be n to the third. So that is not great. So I'm going to try to optimize that if we can. And kind of looking at this, the way I like described it, starting at different points of the string, I'm starting to think maybe we could kind of like have a range within the string that we track with kind of like a starting index and an ending index. And maybe we can like expand, start at the start of the string and expand our ending index to the right. And the moment we kind of encounter a duplicate character or a repeating character, we start to kind of move our start index forward to try to get to a subsequence that doesn't contain that duplicate character anymore. And all the while we're doing that, keep track of like the longest encountered length. And I guess I have another kind of assumption question is, could we use an extra data structure in this question?
Yeah, that's totally fine. I think that sort of sliding window you're describing, that sounds like a pretty good approach to me.
Awesome. Yeah, I think for that sliding window, I'd like to use like a hash set so that we can have pretty constant time in like looking up how often certain characters are within the string already. And we can like do that, like look up very quickly.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Awesome. So if that sounds good, I'm going to go ahead and define our function. I'm going to call it length of longest substring. We take in just one parameter, I'm assuming, which is the string.
Yep.
Then we need to define like the output, which is an integer. Cool. So as I said, would love to use a hash set. So I'm just going to start by initializing it and can just initialize it all to zeros for now and we're going to count how many occurrences of each character that we encounter happen within the substring. And I'm going to multiply that by 128 because I know that we have 128 ASCII characters. So just to start off, initialize it to that. And then going to define the length, which we're going to want to track of that longest substring. I'm going to define that to 0. Getting some, okay, variable sign but never used. That's okay because we haven't used it yet. And then I'm going to use the kind of start and end index like approach that I described with like that sliding window. So the start index, maybe I'll just call it left for clarity. I'm going to assign that to 0. And then what we want to do first to start going through the string, do it in a few ways, a while loop, but maybe I'll do a for loop to start. So you can say for write, and write is referring to my end index, which I described for write in range of the length of the string. Thankfully, saw Connor's previous interview, so I now know that we can up here, but we have to do the length of the string. And then the first thing I want to do in this case is to make sure that basically what we want to do is increment the count of the specific character that we're at by 1. So in the hash set that we have. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to say char is at s at index right because s is our string. And we're going to increment that by 1. And that's okay because we've defined all of the characters, all of the essentially like fields in our hash set to be 0. Mm-hmm. Cool. So then the next thing I want to do is I want to take care of that case, which I mentioned earlier, which is if we encounter a duplicate character, kind of moving the left or the start index forward until we don't have a duplicate character anymore. And since we're using chars as our hash set, the way that we know that we've encountered more than one character is if chars at index right is greater than 1. And so I'm going to do a while loop here because we could have multiple repeating characters within the substring. So I want to make sure that I get rid of all like potential repeating characters, or the repeating character could actually be at a later point in the substring. So I want to get to that point and make sure I move the start index by enough characters forward. So the way we're going to do this is first we want to update the count that we're keeping track of in our hash set for that specific character. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to say chars at s at I think I called it left, and then b minus equals 1. And then what I'm going to do is to move left forward is I'm just going to increment left. Cool. And then one thing which I haven't done yet is I want to make sure I'm keeping track of the length, as we said earlier. So the length at the first iteration will be, we've initialized it to 0. And then first time we calculated, the length between two indexes in a string typically is the ending index minus the starting index plus 1, because strings are 0 index. So in our case, it's right minus left plus 1. If I could spell correctly, that would be great. And then what I'm going to do, so that we always keep track of like the biggest, the maximum possible length, is I'm going to use the max function and say, want to take like the max of either the current length or the length that we keep track of, or the current length based on the right and left integers. And then I think last thing we want to do is return the length, because we want to return that integer. Cool. And I guess just a sanity check a little bit before I run this. Just going to do it with ABCA because it's a little bit shorter than ABCABCDB. So ABCA should be 3, the output for that. So what we're going to do is when we start our for loop, we're going to say that chars that A is equal to 1. We're going to add 1 to that. It's not greater than 1 in the first iteration. So what we're going to do is just take the length and like set it. And because right and left are 0 at that first run through the for loop, it's going to be 0 minus 0 plus 1. So length is going to be 1 at this stage. And then when we get to B, chars at B is going to be incremented to 1. Chars at B still is not greater than 1. So again, we're just going to jump to length. And at this point, it's going to be 2, because 1 minus 0 plus 1 is 2. Then we're at index 2, which is the third character, which is C. So again, setting chars at C to be 1, and then it's not greater than 1. So we just jump and then increment the length again to 3 this time, because 2 minus 0 plus 1 is 3. And then in the final run through of that for loop, we're going to encounter A again. And so chars at A is now equal to 2, which is greater than 1. So what we're going to do is decrement that. So again, chars at A becomes 1. And we're going to move our forward. So, or left, sorry, our left index forward. And what we get now is that we want to take the max of either 3 or 0, 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3, which again is going to give us a length 3. And we've run through basically all of the elements here. So what we're going to do is just return length 3. So just by running through this simple example, I think this should work. And I'm going to write out some test cases. So maybe I'll just print input and maybe just define our string here first to be ABC, ABC, BB. Our input is going to be string, and then we want to say length is equal to calling the function on string, and finally print output to be length. Cool. So may have some errors. I'm just going to run it through the first time and see what happens. And I see here that on line 14, we have list indices must be integers or slices, not strings. So looking at line 14, oh, I think this is super interesting because I referred to ASCII characters in the beginning, but then I didn't really take into account that we can't have like a character itself as like the index, but we have to, I think we have to use a function called ord.
Yep, that's right.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that function returns an integer that represents the Unicode character. So what I want to do is I want to wrap ord around every single time I'm using an index within chars. Those should be all the times. And then input ABC, ABC, BB, output 3. That's great. I'm just going to run through and add like a few more test cases like the ones we mentioned. So BBB, A, B, C, D, E, F. And maybe just add the empty string for good measure to see if that gets us the right result. Cool. So we get input BBB output 1, which is great. Input ABCDF output 6, which is great. PWWEKF. I think this is right. I think
Yep, that looks right.
Okay, F, and then input empty string, output 0. Awesome. Are there, I think this looks good to me. Are there any other edge cases that you want us to take a look at?
No, this looks great to me. And I think you might have mentioned already, but what's the runtime of this final solution?
Yes, so space complexity is like linear, because you're using hash set, and then time complexity. So we have like one for loop, and then which is linear time, and then searching within the hash set itself should be constant time. So I think it comes down still to like linear time. At most, we have to go through each of the characters twice.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. Well, awesome. This looks great. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Of course. Thanks so much, too. It was a fun problem to work through.
Awesome. Have a good one.
You too. Cool.
All right. So those were the 2 mock interviews. I'll just say a few kind of closing words for after the interview. And then I know we're going a little bit over time, but I'll be around if anyone wants to ask questions. And then maybe before that, we can quickly go through just some things that went well in the mock interviews and some things that didn't, so people could sort of give their own feedback and thoughts. But before that, I'll just have a few closing thoughts. So one is, after, we didn't simulate this in the mock interview, but after the interview's over is kind of your chance to ask questions. So now you'd ask questions of your interviewer. And here are some good questions that I like to ask, asking about their team's culture, what their typical day-to-day looks like, things that they've worked on, things that they're proud of. And this is a really good way just to get a sense of what it's really like to work at that company you're interviewing with. I think bad questions are things that you could easily Google or find online, and good questions are questions that kind of are not easily answered online, and actually give you a picture of, would you like to join this company, and what is it like to work there. So sort of last advice I'll say is, don't worry. Interviews are really, really, really high variance. There are great engineers who just do super poorly on some interviews, and that's just sort of unfortunately how it works. So just because you didn't do well on some number of interviews doesn't mean at all that you're not still a great developer, or data scientist, or designer, or whatever path it might be. Everyone has bad interviews sometimes. Interviews are not fun. I don't think I know anyone who enjoys interviews really on either side of it. But just view every interview you do as an opportunity to get better. If you don't pass an interview or get rejected from a company, just try to reflect on that and think about what went well, what didn't go well. Maybe it was the type of problem, maybe it was your communication. Just take some time to learn and grow from each experience. But everyone is going to go through a bad interview. I've gone through plenty. I'm sure everyone else on this call has as well. And so don't worry if that happens to you. So last up, just some takeaways from the talk. One, have the basics down. Going into any interview, just know sort of the basics of the language you're going to be using. Be really comfortable in that setting. Build your toolbox. Be aware of the concepts we talked about in those 2 mock interviews. We looked at a string problem. We looked at a binary search problem. So those sort of concepts, have them ready to go. Do lots of practice problems. The more you practice, the more things you're going to be able to pattern match against, and the more comfortable you're going to be in this sort of really unnatural interview setting. Before you write any code, just like Maria and Connor did, communicate your solution, explain the code you're going to write, and then write it out. And then, just like we saw in those mock interviews, always verbally run through your code, look for issues and solve them proactively, so the interviewer doesn't have to tell you all of your bugs. And I'll say one last time, all of this is about the process, not about the output. Really focus on communicating well, thinking critically, and getting to a solution rather than writing absolutely perfect code at the end of the day. And so that's the end of the workshop. Like I said, we'd love to dive into questions you have for me, as well as some feedback on the mock interview. And so I'll turn it over to David to moderate questions and feedback.
Yeah, Tommy, the first question that came up was, does Tommy have any feedback on Connor's and Maria's interviews, positive and negative?
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say both of those interviews were positive. I think, like I said, the most important part was that communication. And in both cases, Connor and Maria started by asking clarifying questions in advance. They made sure they understood the problem. In both cases, they sort of made a list of inputs and outputs, which I mentioned is a really good way of framing things. Also, thinking out loud was really, really important there. I think in both cases, everybody was sort of constantly narrating. They're never sitting in silence. I think something else that I like that Connor did specifically was ask for a hint when he got stuck. I think it would have been really bad if, imagine Connor was at some mental wall and just didn't see it and was sort of like stuck and like, I don't know, let me just like sit there and think about it. Just asking for a hint, and then we were able to get unstuck and go right down the right path. So I think those are sort of the things I would focus on for the interview. I think in all cases, just making sure that, so we didn't really have enough time because it was intentionally short, but just making sure the code is really readable and clean, and sort of taking the time to maybe create helper functions or more readable variable names. We sort of omitted that on purpose just so the interviews would be short, but that would be sort of the main thing that I would do with more time.
Another question that came up, especially for folks who don't have the luxury of being able to do mock interviews with people like this, are there recommended websites that are good at preparing you for interview questions, for algorithms coding? Is competitive programming helpful?
Yeah, I think there are lots of great websites. So one that I like a lot is called LeetCode. So just leetcode.com. They've got a bunch of problems there. You'll probably find the ones that I posted somewhere on LeetCode as well, because they have so many. They're also great. You can sort of write up your solution and also like see the solutions. Another good one I like a lot is called Project Euler. Same thing, just sort of like gives you practice problems. You can go and implement them in any solution, any language you want. So I'd start there. If you have a competitive programming background, that's awesome. I'm pretty bad at algorithms problems myself. So I think competitive programming can be helpful. I will say if you have done competitive programming before, the difference between competitive programming and interviewing is that in competitive programming, your variable names do not matter. You're sort of like just trying to go super fast. And oftentimes that means being sloppy or like allocating these huge arrays. You don't have to like calculate the links of things. So definitely don't do that. In a real interview, the readability of your code matters a whole lot more. So other sites, sort of more advanced sites, are things like Top Coder, where there's other sort of problems, practice problems. So they'll be a little more advanced, but they're still good practice.
Another question, Tommy, that came from Pamika was, I wonder if most interviewers would give an interviewee a general problem like this for entry level, or if they would likely give a more adaptive problem related to the interviewee and the job in question.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that's sort of what we were getting at before about the different types of interviews. So I'd say this is a really common interview type, where what's nice is that it kind of removes a lot of the background, because you can use whatever language you want. It doesn't require you to know some particular framework or library. You can sort of solve this in a whole bunch of ways. That's the advantage of a problem like this. You may also see, in addition to this, something that's more specific to the role that you're working on. So if you're applying to a web development role, you might have a question like, make a website. So we didn't do a mock interview for that, but I'd say those are less common than these sort of really general questions, but you could still run into them as part of the whole interview process.
And Tommy, for students who aren't at Harvard or Yale and might not be considering FANG companies like Facebook and Apple and Amazon, Netflix and Google, is the kind of prep that we're offering today focused on those types of companies' interviews, or tech more generally?
Yeah, these are really just focused on tech more generally. I think, every company will have its own process and might do something different, but the idea of being asked to write some code in some setting where someone is watching you and having to think through your thought process and think out loud, that's pretty universal at a lot of companies. And, like I said, every company might do something a little bit different or have some more specific interviews, like maybe some, online challenge or something written or something like that. But holistically, you're kind of thinking about all the same things, and all the prep work you do is probably going to apply to a really wide variety of interviews.
And perhaps a question for Maria or Connor. How do you stop getting nervous during your interviews?
I can speak a little bit to that. So short answer is you don't. I get nervous before every interview. But one thing that I like Tommy said before, practicing really helps. And not just practicing on your own or with friends, but also practicing in the forum of other interviews. So I applied to a lot of companies this year, and so I have gotten to the point where if I'm doing a few interviews a week. So like the first week I was doing interviews, I was a lot more nervous than now, where it seems like kind of a routine. I know my introduction. I know how to ask clarifying questions. I know what questions I'm going to ask interviewers about their job, different things like that. So I would say that just like a lot of things, the more you do it, the less nervous you'll be.
Yeah,
Maria?
plus I would say repetition. I also think if you can practice with friends and kind of switch up the interviewer interviewee roles, you can also kind of like develop some empathy like on the other side as well. But really just put yourself in those situations and kind of simulate the interview situation, even when you're solving practice problems on your own. And don't just kind of like Tommy alluded to earlier, don't just be like, oh, I think I kind of know how to do this. And then look at the solution and be like, yeah, that's what I was going to do. Like, but actually like time yourself and go through it and repeat as often as possible.
And Tommy, a technical question. You mentioned one or more times that people should factor out common logic. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, something I say all the time. But oftentimes when you're writing code, just generally, but also in an interview, you might find that some of the code you have is repeated. Either it's repeated, literally the code is the same, like you're doing the same thing to different variables, or just parts of the logic are repeated. Like maybe you're doing a null check, or you're you're doing some kind of string manipulation that's similar in multiple parts. So if you notice those kind of similarities or repeated logic in your code, try to create a separate helper function that just does that logic, and then call that helper function from the main function you've created for your interview. So that process is, I think it comes from algebra, like factoring things. You could sort of factor out the logic by saying, here's these two things that are common, put it into some common function that you call in both cases.
And Tommy, a few folks have asked whether they should be commenting their code in interviews.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I will say your interviewer preference might be different, but depending on the interviewer. Me personally, I wouldn't spend a lot of time on that because you don't have a lot of time in your interview. They're already narrating really naturally what your code is doing. And so if you're just typing out a comment that matches exactly what you're saying, that's just describing what the code is doing, it's probably not a great use of time. Depending on your style and your interview style, maybe, adding like a quick doc string to the function or just a comment at the top of the function that explains what it's going to do can be helpful. But in general, I wouldn't spend a lot of time commenting the code as you go, given the setting.
And we do have time for a few more questions. In fact, if you'd like to raise your virtual hand in Zoom by clicking the raise hand icon, happy to call on some folks if you have your video and microphone on. And Tommy, in the meantime, a couple of folks asked, among them Aisha, if you face a problem while writing your code and can't think of the solution even after a hint, what can you do?
Yeah, I will say it happens. I've hit many a wall in an interview. I think, even if the interviewer gives you a hint and you think about it, I think it's super reasonable to say, okay, I see what you're saying, but I'm not sure how that applies to the problem, or I'm not sure I totally follow. Can you give me some more information? Basically, it's a conversation. Your interviewer isn't, there to be a robot or sort of like try to put you in a situation that's tough. They want you to succeed. And so if they're trying to help you and they haven't yet helped you yet, just keep asking for more clarifying questions or more hints until eventually you get unstuck. But sometimes, I've been in interviews where I'm like, hey, I just didn't get it. The interviewer had to like totally handhold me through to the problem, which is usually what'll happen. They'll just give you hints that are like so obvious. They're like writing the code for you. And then, I got rejected, and it happens. But the more you're making it a conversation, a dialogue, the more opportunities you have to be helped.
Okay, and we have a hand up from Yashvi, if I'm saying that right. Yashvi, if you'd like to say hello and what your question is.
Greetings from India to all of you. And I would like to ask Tommy sir, what was the best thing one can do to impress any interviewer, probably in etiquettes or something like that?
Sure. So if I had sort of like one thing that would impress an interviewer the most. Yeah, I think that for me, the most important part of the interview is communication. So if I were to focus on one thing, or the thing as an interviewer that I come out of an interview, I'm like, wow, that was great. That thing is probably because they communicated really, really well. Whether that was asking clarifying questions, just explaining their approach or the way they thought about the problem, that's usually way more important to me than, oh, cool, they used this crazy like Python built-in I didn't know existed. Communication is way more important than that.
And a question from Karthik, if you'd like to say hello, where you're from and what your question is.
Hello, David sir and Tommy sir. I'm also from India. I just have a question. For a beginner level technical interview, is clean code really matters? The most optimized code really it matters, or like an optimum level code or an ordinary level code? I just want to know that.
Yeah, so I think the number one thing that matters is the process. So the way that you get to that code and the way you're reasoning and communicating, that's way more important than how perfectly optimized your code was. And then the other thing I'll say is that the expectations the interviewer has is going to vary based on your experience level. So, let's say I'm asking a question of someone with 20 years of experience, I'd expect their code to be better than I'm interviewing someone for their first internship. So I think it's going to vary. As you're practicing, I'd say write the best code that you can. Make sure that you're thinking about is the code clean, but like I said, the process and your thought process communication is always going to be more important than the code you write.
Michael, would you like to say hello and ask your question next?
Yeah, hi. My name is Michael, Fairfield, Connecticut. So this is kind of just like, I had to think a little bit about this question because you guys covered so much and I felt like any technical questions I had were already answered. So anyway, I'll just ask you, I'm a pretty big dude, like I'm 6'4", 260 pounds. Sometimes I don't have the nicest face on, you know what I mean? So what can I do when I get to the interview and I'm nervous and I just look mean? What are some things that maybe I can do to make my interviewer feel a little bit more comfortable and know that, we're here trying to accomplish the same goals?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I'm also someone who I'm pretty bad at like hiding my emotions, which you could probably see as I'm talking about resumes and things I'm tired of seeing on them. I think the biggest thing is just, the interviewer can tell when you're really nervous. Like sometimes I go in an interview and I'm like, oh man, this person, I can tell within like 30 seconds, they're like super nervous. Me as an interviewer, I'll try to like keep it light and, help calm you down or make you less nervous. Not every interviewer can or wants to do that. The number one thing is just the more practice you have, I think is really important. For some people, having like a glass of water like available to them can be really helpful. So just like bringing a couple water bottles if it's on site. I have a water bottle here, just having that ready. Taking a deep breath before you start talking or before you turn on that Zoom call makes a huge difference. So I think little things like that. Everybody is a little bit different about sort of like, how to make them feel less nervous. But I think, how nervous you are on your first interview and how nervous you are in like your 50th is like such a big gap that you just sort of have to like pay that cost, go through a bunch. And then for many people, just eventually it starts becoming less and less nerve-wracking.
Sarah, would you like to say hello and ask your question next?
Hello, and first of all, thank you very much for your information. And I want to ask that how can we explain our job gap? Before starting this field, IT career, I had a different experience in different fields. And then I gave a break like 5 years. After that 5 years, I'm starting to searching for a job in IT field. So how can I explain this gap in my job experience? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And something I'll say is that the experience you just described of coming from a different field or taking a break in between roles for some number of years, it's becoming more and more common. So, maybe 10 years ago, this was something you really had to worry about. People were only in engineering if they had a degree in engineering. I think now so many people are coming from other career paths and going through boot camps or online courses or switching careers into engineering that it almost doesn't need to be explained as much today as it would many years ago. But I would just sort of be honest. I'd say, here's my background. It was in some other field, could be totally unrelated to software, totally unrelated to engineering. Talk about your experience there, the impact you had, the sort of what you learned, and then just talk about why you want to switch to engineering and what you've done so far and why you're excited about it, why you're excited to learn more and help a company and have impact. But I would say my short answer is I wouldn't worry too much about it. And then to explain it, just sort of be honest about what you've done in the past and why you're looking to switch.
And Nisarg, if I'm saying that right, would you like to say hello and ask your question?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Nisarg Kudbanti and I'm from India. And greetings to Tommy sir and David sir and everyone else. So over to my question. If we get stuck on a problem, what is the optimum time to think over it before stating that we are unable to solve it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what sort of like at what point do you ask for the hint? Um, I'll say one thing to keep in mind is just sort of the total duration of the interview. So if you know you're in a 45-minute interview versus you're in a 2-hour interview, my general heuristic is something like 3 to 5 minutes. If you've made like no progress in 3 to 5 minutes, that's when I would try to ask for a hint. Sometimes just as you're sort of thinking out loud, you'll eventually run out of things to say because you've run out of things to think of. And at that point too, if you find yourself being silent or just not making any progress, think for a minute or two and then say, actually, I'm not sure. Can I have a hint? So if you're thinking it's, in the ballpark of like 20 to 30 minutes, I'd say way lower than that. But I also would say, much greater than like 30 seconds, because you'll give yourself a few minutes to actually process it and think.
We have time for a few more questions. Do feel free to raise a virtual hand and turn on your camera if you'd like to ask on camera, or repaste your question in the chat if we might have missed it. We're doing our best to field as many as we can. Yuvraj, if I'm saying that right, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hello.
Hello.
Hello. Okay. So, hi guys, my name is Yuvraj, and I would like to ask a question from a entrepreneur's standpoint, right? So a lot of companies in the recent times have, changed the whole paradigm of hiring people and all that. So how do you expect that it might change furthermore? Like even as a student, if I look at, things have changed, from going offline, doing interviews and all that to going online due to this pandemic and all that. So do you think things could change further, or this is the top levels or something like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Sort of how interviews have evolved and where they're going. Certainly these virtual interviews are way, way more common. Many companies, even if you could come on site, just so much more convenient to sort of interview someone remotely rather than traveling, 6 hours in a plane, being tired at 9 a.m. the next day for the interview, which is not fun. So that's definitely a big one. I think that's a trend that will stick. I think many companies will still do on-sites, but I think before, I remember the companies I've worked at and friends have had like a hard policy on, we have to meet you in person before you hire me. Like just cannot join the team unless we meet you in person. I don't know why, but that was a policy. I don't think you'll see very many things like that anymore. I think another thing that's been changing is that many companies are asking more of these practical questions, especially to folks with more experience. And I think that's good and bad. I think for many folks coming out of university or new grads, asking them a practical question in many cases is worse, just because they haven't ever written production code or launched a production website. And so asking somebody to do that, it actually doesn't give you that much signal. And asking an algorithms question to a student who's taken algorithms classes and they're really good at that can actually be higher signal. And so where I see the shift coming is that if you have the experience of building these systems, we're going to ask you about it and maybe ask you to build something similar. And if you don't, then we're not. Where I think, a few years ago, there's this blanket, everybody has to do whiteboard questions because whiteboard questions are the be all end all. And I'd say they have a purpose. A lot of people are like, whiteboard questions are always bad. They're useless. I don't subscribe to that at all. I've interviewed so many students who do better on these than they do on the, build a website question. So they have their place. And I think they're becoming more of a specialized thing than a blanket part of the process.
And Tommy, a couple of questions that have come up a few times now in the chat relate to folks who either don't have much work experience because they're just coming out of college, or they're older and have gaps in their resume for some reason. What kinds of personal technical projects should people in those situations take on? And when it comes to languages, given that they might have a choice of languages, which languages should they be picking up for interviews?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll start with the second one. I would pick up languages that are more popular. So I think that takes the form of Python or JavaScript would probably be my top two. Those are languages you could use to, build a little web application or a visualization or a command line application. These are, I wouldn't try to, pick up as a first language something like Haskell or Rust or some of these more the sort of less mainstream and have a higher barrier to entry. So Python or JavaScript are good ones to start with. And then for personal project, I would say build something that's interesting to you. My best advice to people is that everyone in their day-to-day has some problem that they're dealing with. Maybe it's taking notes in class or organizing some files in their laptop, or everyone sort of has these little problems that they deal with. And just write a little app to solve them for yourself. Maybe it's I remember like one of the first things I built was this little like weather visualizer because I like didn't like the weather.com things. I was like, oh, let me like use their API and just build like a little weather app. And I just like had that like on my, in my room where I could like wake up and check my little weather app. And it was like, there's thousands of weather apps out there, but like, who cares? It was like a problem that I thought was kind of interesting and I went and solved it. So, everybody has those little things that are interesting to them. So pick something that's interesting to you and write a little, command line application or web application to solve it.
Few final questions here. Sarah, would you like to ask your question and tell us where you are in the world? Sarah?
Hello. Hi, I'm Sarah.
Hello.
From Algeria. And I was wondering, do you think I could ask all the questions that are in my mind about the work and the company to my interviewer, even after I know that I failed in my code and writing the code and solving the problem? Do I have the right to ask them or not?
Oh, like at the end of the interview, sort of like when they ask you
Yes.
have any questions for me, even if you did that the interview didn't go well.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. I think you should always, they're still interested in giving you a good experience with the company, even though you didn't pass this interview. Who knows? You might come back a year or two later, interview again, and then do fantastic. And so if the interviewer, can give you a good picture of the company now, that might help you say, oh, I will go reapply again because I really like the person I talked to and I've learned a lot since that first interview. So yeah, I would definitely say, when you have a bad interview experience, it happens to everyone. Try not to get too down on yourself. When they ask you if you have any questions for me, I'd still ask the prepared questions you had about, their day to day or the things that they changed about the company. So I wouldn't change any of that. And then, who knows, you could see that same interviewer again a few years later.
And Tomas, would you like to say hello and where you're from along with your question?
Yeah, sure. What's up, guys? I've enjoyed a lot, and I'd like to know, sometimes when it comes to the interview, there are companies that ask you about your salary. Oh, by the way, I'm from Venezuela, I didn't mention. So when it comes to interviews, there are companies that ask you about the salaries. So is there a way to know what would be the best? Because I think this was not so covering like in this.
Yeah, so it's how to think about salary and negotiation generally.
Like a way to know what would be the best amount, or because sometimes we could ask like too much or too little. And are we even supposed to answer that, or we can just avoid that question?
Yeah, this one's a tough one because it's going to vary a lot by role and country and company. So I can try to give some general advice that may or may not be a little too US specific, just because I'm not super familiar with all the different international conventions. But something that is certainly applicable is before you go into a role, try to get a general sense for what the sort of the market is paying for that role. There's lots of sites online you can look at, whether they be Glassdoor. There's another one that's in the US called levels.fyi, where people just sort of publish, here are the ranges of what I'm making at this role. The company might also publish it in advance. There's some sites like AngelList that startup use to recruit, and it's sort of a required field as how much are you going to be offering for this role. Yeah, just do a little bit of research in advance. I'd say try to give a range too. I think some people are like, I must make, at least N amount of dollars, or I'm not interested. I think that's usually not the right approach, but giving sort of a general range. Also sort of talking about what you're currently making in your role, and if what you'd ideally like to be making more than that. Having your current compensation can be kind of a baseline there. So I think, yeah, my general advice is just to be, try to be honest and try to do some research in advance, and then that can help you avoid this outcome where you're asking for something that's way too low or way too high. But yeah, every company is going to be a little bit different in how they handle this. Some companies want you to disclose what you're looking for first. Some companies say, here's the role and the level we're going to level you at. Here's what people in that role and level make. Going to be a little bit different, but the research part you can always do.
I think we have time for a few more questions. Hope folks will forgive if we don't get to everyone. We also want to leave a moment at the end for Maria and Connor, if you're amenable, to offer just some final thoughts of your own. But first, Aisha, if I'm saying that right, would you like to say hello, where you're from, and your question?
I am from Pakistan, and it's Aisha. And first of all, Yeah, and first of all, I have to say that this lesson has been great. I did not know most of the things, and some things really surprised me. So I absolutely enjoyed this lesson. And my question is that does it like matter, like the style of the interview, does that differ if you have like a different level of experience or your level of your education or something like that, or the level at what you are like in CS? If I'm like an absolute beginner, or like I have done like really less experience, like 1 year or 2 year, does it matter like the style of the interview or the interviewer itself or the assignment?
Yeah, it's a great question. So sort of how things vary based on experience. So the general setting tends to be the same. Of even people with a lot of experience will still ask a question of the form, write a function that takes this as input and takes that as output. I think the expectations will vary a bit. For someone who's really new to CS, the problem we ask might be a little easier, a little more straightforward to solve. For somebody who has more experience, might ask something a little bit harder. And then I mentioned before, something that you'll see as you have more experience is more questions that are a little more practical, telling me about how you've architected some large scale system in the past, or to build something from scratch that would be production ready. Where for students, they're usually more asking questions about the things that you've covered in your courses. Many people take a data structures or an algorithms course, and so we'll ask a question about data structures or algorithms. I think in general, the ideal interview, and what a lot of interviewers do, and hopefully they're all doing, is sort of looking at your experience, seeing what you've done in the past, and then asking questions based on that. So if you've never built a large scale backend system, asking you to build a large scale backend system doesn't really make sense. I'd rather ask questions that you're going to get a lot of signal out of, or I'm going to understand, are you a good fit for the role I'm hiring for? And if I just ask you something where you have no idea, then I'm actually not getting any information.
And Andrew, we saw your hand go up earlier. Would you like to say hello and ask your question?
Andrew. Hello, my name is Andrew.
Hello, Andrew. My name is David. Oh, please go ahead.
My question is, can I get a work after finishing university early?
Can you say it one more time? What about university?
Can I get a job after completing university early?
Tommy, can one get a job after completing university?
Yeah, definitely. There's lots of job opportunities that are especially designed for folks who are just coming out of university and haven't had any jobs before. Internships can also be a great way of getting a role if you haven't had any experience yet. So definitely lots of great roles you can get just out of college.
Nice. And can we go next to Shalom, if you'd like to say hello and where you're from with your question?
Hello, my name is Shalom and I am from South Africa, currently in Beijing. My question is, I studied chemical engineering and technology, so this is really new to me. I recently started my course on CS50. My question is, what do I study after completing that course?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sort of after CS50, where do you go next? I'm sure David has thoughts on this as well. But I would say in general, for interviewing specifically, any course that has data structures or algorithms written in it, those can be really, really helpful. So the courses where you're going to learn, how to do, what a binary tree is, and, how to implement a hash table, some of which you cover in CS50, but there's sort of more advanced data structures and algorithms. So I'd say those are the most useful courses you can take for interviewing. And then maybe David wants to answer the more general question of where to go next.
Yeah, we often recommend that students explore another type of programming, functional programming, object-oriented programming, keywords like those, as well as a good course on data structures and algorithms, for instance. I'm biased too, because I work with a whole team here that produces courses that can be taken both before and after CS50. But Maria, can we perhaps ask you, having been in the real world as an engineer for some time, what you found most helpful after an intro class like CS50?
Yeah, so I think really kind of trying to get like a breadth of like classes out there and exploring different interests would be good. Like when I first took CS50, some of my next classes that I took were like systems, like operating programming, data structures and algorithms, data visualization. And I found like a lot of like the more visual and design oriented classes super interesting. So definitely got a chance to focus in on that as well. But definitely would say that exploring a breadth of things so that you can really decide what you want to hone in on and what really interests you is always a good idea.
And I think Tommy's emphasis on personal projects earlier is important because we see among online students a real tendency to take one course, then another course, then another course, and it's never really clear when it ends. And it doesn't need to end, but at some point you should really leave the nest, so to speak, and take on some personal project, pursue some work project so that you feel like you're actually now applying the skills that you've learned in classrooms. Some final questions. Can we go next to Remington? If you'd like to ask your question and say where you're from.
Yes, my name's Remington. I'm currently in the UK in quarantine. It's lovely to join you guys today. It was super helpful. I don't mean to focus too much on the resumes, but it's another resume question. So if I'm a student, non-CS major, and I've had like some internships that are not really tech related, is it more valuable to add those to kind of fill out my resume, or should I really try to like do more personal projects and then add those into my resume instead? So which one would be more valuable is my question.
Yeah, I would say if I had to pick between those two, I would say the latter. So having personal projects that are related to the roles that you're applying to are really helpful. So for instance, if you're applying to a web development role, showing some websites you built is really helpful. And I'd say, even if you only have a few, that's totally fine. Sort of fill out the rest of your space with your prior experience. But an interviewer will definitely love to see something that's related to the role that you're applying to more than, the past experience you do have. So I'd say projects first, then fill out the rest with the prior experience you do have, and definitely include that as well.
And Spondan, if I'm saying that right, would you like to say hello and ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, sir. I'm from Bangladesh. My question is, sometimes coding is loving, or sometimes it's frustrated. So when we are frustrated, so what we can do?
Sorry, do you mind repeating that? I'm not sure I totally understood the question.
As I say, sometimes coding we love, but sometimes when we're stuck. Sometimes when we're stuck, then we frustrated. So what can we do? We change the language and change another track, but how to the process? Actually, can you understand?
I'm not sure we followed. Spondan, do you mind sending me a direct message just so I can hear it more carefully? The audio wasn't great for me.
Oh, I am so sorry.
No worries. So let's do this. Let's move on to someone else. And Spondan, can you send me a private message, and then I'll verbalize it for you in a moment.
Sure. Okay.
Sure. And Shoira, if I'm saying that right, would you like to say hello and your question?
Yeah, hi. My name is Shoira. I'm from India. My question was that is keeping a smile on your face while the interview is not going that much well. So does that affect any impact on the interviewer?
Yeah, I'd say whether, everyone sort of knows that interviews can be really stressful. And so I don't think I've ever expected anyone to sort of be like, totally happy and not stressed the whole time. So I would say, the best, it sort of all comes down to communication. I think as long as you're communicating clearly and you're having a good dialogue with your interviewer, and you're able to share your ideas and listen to feedback from your interviewer and sort of hear their hints, I think that's the most important thing. But everybody's really nervous, and I wouldn't recommend anyone trying to like fake how they're feeling, or sort of like pretend to be feeling a certain way, when the reality is that everybody knows that it's nerve-wracking, and so interviewers don't expect you to be doing that anyway, and it all just sort of comes down to communication. As long as the communication is effective, that's the most important thing.
Still keeping an eye out for Spondan's typed question, but let's go lastly to Pawan Kumar, if I'm saying that right. My apologies.
Yes, perfect. Yeah,
Okay.
so thank you so much for this opportunity. So my question is more of on the system design level. So yeah, we did so much hard work for the brilliant years, and somehow we were able to break the coding interviews. But then we have another phase called system design, where for someone with my experience, I have a 10 years experience. I live in United States, and it's though I have experience when it comes to their questions on how do you design a Facebook, how do you design a Twitter. Yeah, we design things in our side, but it doesn't mean it's going to be that level. So can you please give me some idea of how do I prepare for the system design interviews?
Yeah, for sure. I'll give some quick thoughts on systems design interviews. So generally speaking, what we're looking for in a systems design interview is often something architectural. So, for example, you mentioned sort of how do you build the Facebook newsfeed, for instance. So we're not looking for precisely like, I would use 0MQ with a fan out architecture and a multi-layered Redis tier for caching. Like, if you could say that's great, but we're more concerned about architectural things. Like, here's what the schema of the database would be. Here's how rows are written to the database. Here's where the caching layers are, what's being cached. Here's what's being read from those. So it's almost like the goal of a systems design interview is kind of to have a diagram out on a whiteboard, either verbally or literally, that sort of explains all of the major components of the system and how they interact. And that's much more important than, picking the individual library or the sort of implementation details within that diagram. I think if you can speak to technologies you have used in the past and said, in the past we used Kafka for message passing, and here's some things I liked about it, but here are some ways where it kind of broke down and things like that. That experience is really valuable. But for a systems design interview, we're almost never looking for some like really precise answer. The other thing we're also not necessarily looking for is exactly what part of the system you design. In many cases, it's really intentionally ambiguous. Like one that I've got in the past is just, how would you make Google Maps? End of question, sort of like turn it over to me. And that could mean anything, right? That could be the front end. That could be like, how do you implement all the scrolling? It could be like how do you store all of the map? Like there's tiles of different elevation levels and resolutions. How do you store that? It could be, how do you do like Google Maps includes routes? Like how do you do route planning and traffic? And it was sort of intentionally ambiguous. And the interviewer was like, oh, I don't know, whatever you want to design, like do it. Like you've got an hour. Let's just kind of like see what we can do. And so I'd keep that in mind as well, that sometimes it might feel like the interviewer doesn't have anything in mind, and it's because we don't. We just sort of want to see where you gravitate to, because you're naturally going to gravitate, hopefully, towards the thing where you have the most experience and where you can design the best thing. So really focus on that architecture, focus on what are the components of the system, how do those components interact, what are the abstraction barriers between those systems, and then if you can talk about implementation details like frameworks or libraries or patterns you've used in the past, then you can do so. But we're really mostly interested in architectural decisions.
And Tommy Sponden's question was about what should you do when you get frustrated and stuck with coding?
Yeah, I think, in an interview, like I said, it happens to everybody. It'll happen to you. It's happened to me. I think, just taking a deep breath, taking just a step back, just 10 seconds, take a step back and think and calm yourself down as best as you can. Take a glass of water if they have one, if they don't, bring one so you have one. And then just sort of, ask for a hint. I think, a lot of interviewees, when they get frustrated, they sort of get angry or sort of get mad. And I think, it certainly might happen. Just try to, as best you can, try to take a step back and sort of, just ask for help in a way that's sort of keeping the conversation light and, not becoming overly angry. But it certainly can happen and has happened to me and people I've been interviewing in the past. So yeah, just I would say if you get frustrated, just sort of ask for a hint, take a deep breath, and just remind yourself that everybody fails these things. It's not just you.
I hope folks who still have their hands up will forgive if we didn't get to all questions, but in our remaining minutes here, just wanted to give Maria and Connor and then Tommy the final word with some final advice. Maria?
Yeah, I really would just say, don't be worried or scared when you mess up. I have messed up so many interviews and I sometimes still think back to them and I kind of find them funny now thinking back because I really just put so much pressure on myself that it even prevented me from doing well and showing what I knew well and actually thinking clearly in the moment. And we said this a lot, but the best way to do that is to really just practice and put yourself in those high stress situations to get yourself more used to them. And really believe in all of you, especially like in coming to this. I think you're taking like the best steps that you can. So it really is just about taking this and like these guidelines that we shared today and just practicing and really like mastering everything. So thanks so much for spending the past few hours with us.
Thank you, Maria. And Connor?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I would say the biggest thing is to, even though it's very difficult, to try and be as relaxed as you can, try to have a good outlook on it. One thing that I think I've found out over the last couple of years that I had wished I had known going into it is that a lot of the interview process is a bit random. So there can be like you might get a question that you feel really confident about or a question that you just have no idea what to do. And there can also be interviews where you feel like you did really well and then you don't get into the next round, or interviews that you feel like you bombed and then you do get into the next round. So that, I think that's kind of helpful to know, because like even if you struggle with a question for a while, it's not a good idea to like kind of give up on that interview. You want to keep trying, like keep interacting with your interviewer, and you never know what's going to happen.
Thank you as well. And thank you to all of the team here behind the scenes who've been making this possible. And certainly Tommy, who prepared so much of today's materials along with Maria and Connor. Tommy, final advice you'd like to leave folks with?
Yeah, final advice. I'll say don't give up. I'll never forget my first interview where I was interviewing at a big tech company, and we're in a building with an elevator, and the two people from the interview, my interviewer and someone else in the company, were in the elevator. And they were talking about how bad I did in the interview. Like, this kid was such a joke. And I walked into the elevator and then took the elevator down 10 floors with them as they just sort of like stared at me, and everybody knew what was happening. So I'll never forget that. It happens to everybody. Definitely don't give up. You can fail a ton of interviews before you eventually succeed, and that's totally okay. Everybody goes through that. So yeah, you might feel like this is impossible. Who can possibly do this? You can. Just don't give up and you'll get there.
Thank you so much, Tommy. Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you online for CS50 again soon.